For 6 agonizing years, I swallowed my absolute pride and my suffocating pain, forced to watch another woman play mother to my child on social media. My ex-husband convinced the court and the world that I was unstable, locking my daughter away behind the towering iron gates of his flawless, wealthy life. I played the role of the defeated, submissive ex-wife because he held all the cards and all the money. But the absolute truth has a very funny way of surviving in the dark. It started with a single text message in the dead of night using a secret distress code only my little girl and I knew. A message that proved my instinct was right all along. He lied about everything. It was exactly 12:03 in the morning when my phone vibrated violently against the cheap laminate wood of my nightstand. The sharp, aggressive buzz shattered the heavy silence of my small apartment bedroom. I had just come off a grueling 14-hour shift at the hospital pediatric ward. My shoulders ached and my eyes were burning from pure exhaustion. But when you are a mother who had her flesh and blood ripped away by a corrupt legal system, you never truly sleep. You simply wait in the dark. I reached over and grabbed the glowing screen. The sender was an unknown blocked number, but the short, desperate text displayed in the harsh white light made the blood in my veins run completely cold. Firefly. Mom, do not call him. Come alone. He lied about everything. The door under the stairs. Firefly. My breath completely caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs with such a violent force that my chest physically ached. Firefly was not just a random word. It was a lifeline. It was the absolute last secret I shared with my daughter. 6 years ago, when Lily was only 5 years old, I knelt down in the sterile hallway of the county courthouse and whispered that exact word into her tiny ear, right before the judge brought down the heavy wooden gavel that destroyed my entire world. I held her small face in my trembling hands and told her that if she was ever in danger, if she ever needed me and could not speak out loud, she needed to send me this word. I promised her that if I ever saw the word Firefly, I would tear apart the earth to find her. Gregory. My charismatic, high-flying wealth manager husband had stood in that courtroom wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and a sickening mask of fake, sorrowful concern. He used his massive corporate fortune to hire a team of ruthless, predatory lawyers to paint me as an unstable, hysterical, and unfit mother. He systematically twisted my long, grueling nursing shifts, my sheer physical exhaustion, and a brief struggle with postpartum anxiety into a fabricated narrative of severe mental instability. He legally stole my daughter using his wealth and his manufactured social standing. And for 6 long years, I had to endure the pure, unfiltered agony of seeing Lily only during sterile, heavily supervised 2-hour visits on alternating weekends. I did not reply to the text message. I did not dare dial the unknown number. I did not call the police. The chief of police in Gregory's ultra-wealthy district attended his massive megachurch and regularly played golf with his inner circle. If I called the authorities to report a suspicious text, Gregory would be notified before the dispatcher even put down the phone receiver. The message explicitly said, "Come alone." I scrambled out of my bed. I did not even bother changing out of my faded blue hospital scrubs. I threw a heavy beige trench coat over my shoulders, shoved my bare feet into rubber rain boots, and grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking so violently that the keys slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the linoleum floor. The adrenaline now coursing through my system was raw and primitive. It was the blinding instinct of a mother moving in for the kill. I threw my old sedan into gear and tore out of my apartment complex parking lot. A massive thunderstorm had rolled into the city. The rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, lashing against the windshield like a swarm of angry hornets. The old windshield wipers beat back and forth, struggling to clear the heavy deluge. But I did not ease my foot off the gas pedal. My worn sneakers pressed the accelerator harder, pushing the glowing speedometer past 90 miles per hour as I merged onto the dark interstate, heading toward the exclusive North Shore suburbs. The wet, slick asphalt blurred dangerously beneath my tires. Every single mile marker I passed fueled the rising, roaring fire in my chest. For 6 years, I had forced myself to play by their twisted rules. I had endured the weekly public humiliation. I had watched silently from the shadows, while Gregory curated a flawless, sickeningly perfect Christian family image for the world to worship. He had quickly married Ashley, a 24-year-old former pageant queen, whose entire existence revolved around designer labels, luxury aesthetic branding, and social media validation. Together, they shamelessly plastered Lily's face across Instagram and Facebook. They dressed my little girl in matching expensive pastel outfits, posing in front of their sprawling stone mansion, smiling brightly for the high-resolution cameras at elite charity drives and exclusive church fundraisers. They sold the public a highly profitable fantasy of piety and perfection. But I knew my daughter. I saw how her beautiful bright eyes looked duller, emptier, and more terrified with every passing year. Ashley gleefully played the role of the devoted saving stepmother, raking in lucrative brand sponsorships and community praise while I sat in a bleak grey visitation center offering my own child cheap coloring books across a plastic folding table. I had to sit there and be watched by a paid court supervisor holding a yellow legal pad documenting my every tear and every word to ensure I did not overstep my legal boundaries. I gripped the cold leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a stark bone white. I remembered our very last supervised visit just 2 weeks ago. Lily was 11 years old now. She sat across from me with her small shoulders hunched protectively, picking nervously at her fingernails. She looked completely exhausted, shadowing the vibrant, joyful toddler I once held. When I asked her how school was going, she just offered rehearsed robotic answers. "Everything is great, Mom. Ashley bought me a new dress. Dad is taking us to a ski resort." But when the court supervisor briefly looked away to check her glowing phone screen, Lily had reached under the plastic table, grabbed my hand, and squeezed my fingers so incredibly hard that her nails dug into my skin. She did not say a single word out loud, but her wide, terrified eyes were screaming for help. I knew right then that the glossy social media pictures were a complete lie. I knew my daughter was drowning inside their mansion of glass and hypocrisy. Now driving blindly through this violent storm, the terrifying realization hit me with the crushing force of a freight train. The door under the stairs. She was hiding. She was trapped inside her own home. The wide concrete highway eventually gave way to winding, heavily wooded roads. The ornate streetlights here were placed far apart, casting long, eerie, distorted shadows across the massive manicured lawns of the ultra-wealthy elite. The freezing rain was absolutely relentless, forming deep, muddy puddles that splashed violently against the rusted undercarriage of my car. I knew Gregory's neighborhood intimately. It was an exclusive gated community of sprawling modern estates, high wrought iron fences, and private roaming security patrols. I killed my headlights a quarter-mile away from his street, allowing the darkness to swallow my vehicle. I pulled my car into the pitch-black shadow of an unfinished residential construction site, 2 blocks away from his actual address. I could not risk the loud grinding sound of my old engine alerting their private security or his guests. I turned the key and killed the ignition, plunging the small cabin into absolute suffocating darkness. I sat there in the silence for 3 full seconds, listening to the heavy rain hammer against the metal roof. I took one final deep, steadying breath, deliberately burying the terrified weeping nurse and pulling forward the cold, calculating, and extremely dangerous mother. I pushed the car door open and stepped out into the freezing deluge. The heavy rain soaked completely through my trench coat almost instantly. The icy water plastered my hair to my face and seeped down into my boots, but I felt absolutely nothing. The bitter chill in the night air was completely insignificant compared to the absolute ice flowing through my veins. I kept my body low to the ground, hugging the thick tree line. My boots sank deep into the muddy, expensive landscaping, moving silently through the shadows like a ghost. The strong scent of wet pine and expensive imported mulch filled my nostrils. As I rounded the corner of the long, sweeping driveway, Gregory's massive estate finally came into view. The mansion was a colossal modern fortress built of dark stone and sheer glass panels. And tonight, despite the terrible weather, it was blazing with brilliant warm light. The long circular driveway was absolutely packed with a fleet of luxury vehicles. Glossy black Mercedes SUVs, Range Rovers, and sleek Bentleys were lined up back to back in the pouring rain. Valets wearing matching black rain ponchos were rushing frantically back and forth under a massive white canvas awning, shouting orders to one another. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows on the second floor, I could clearly see the moving silhouettes of dozens of wealthy guests. Gregory and Ashley were hosting one of their famous high-profile charity galas. I could see the bright, sparkling glint of massive crystal chandeliers, the sharp cut of custom tuxedos, and the flowing fabric of glittering evening gowns. I could almost hear the arrogant clinking of crystal champagne glasses and the smooth, manufactured laughter of my ex-husband charming his wealthy, gullible donors. He was standing up there, in the warmth, soaking in the blind admiration of the city's elite, playing the grand role of the generous, untouchable philanthropist, while my terrified daughter was sending me a desperate distress signal from the dark belly of his own house. I stayed completely crouched, pressing my back against the rough cold stone of the perimeter retaining wall. The grand front entrance was crawling with busy catering staff and frantic valets, so I crept slowly along the dark side of the sprawling house, moving toward the hidden service entrance near the catering kitchen. The security system Gregory had installed was an absolute state-of-the-art nightmare, costing tens of thousands of dollars. It featured sweeping motion sensors, high-definition night vision cameras, and complex biometric locks. During our marriage, he used to brag about it, constantly puffing out his chest and boasting to his friends about how completely impenetrable his fortress was. But Gregory had one massive fatal flaw. He was incredibly, deeply arrogant, and his unchecked arrogance always bred sheer laziness. I finally reached the heavy reinforced steel door of the service entrance. Hidden behind a decorative wrought iron grate was the glowing digital keypad for the main alarm system. 6 years ago, when this massive house was first being built and we were still legally married, the lead contractors had set a temporary backdoor service code for the electricians and plumbers to use during construction. Gregory had explicitly told me he would update the system, but he never bothered to actually change the temporary numbers. He honestly thought no one in the world would ever dare trespass on his magnificent property, and he certainly never thought his discarded, submissive ex-wife would ever have the intellect or the sheer nerve to test his defenses. I wiped the blinding rainwater from my eyes and reached out with a trembling, soaked finger. I pressed the cold, glowing digits. 4, 7, 2, 9. The digital keypad beeped softly. A tiny green indicator light flashed brilliantly in the dark. The heavy internal deadbolt retracted with a deep, satisfying mechanical click. I grabbed the cold metal handle, pulled the heavy steel door open, and slipped silently inside, stepping out of the howling, violent storm and into the suffocating, immaculate warmth of Gregory's house. I closed the heavy door perfectly silently behind me, locking out the rain and the wind. The air inside the service corridor smelled strongly of roasted duck, expensive truffles, and rich vanilla-scented designer candles. It was the sickening scent of stolen wealth and manufactured perfection. High above me, I could hear the muffled, elegant notes of a live string quartet drifting softly down from the main grand ballroom. I stood completely still in the dark shadows of the narrow hallway, water dripping heavily from my soaked trench coat onto the polished, pristine hardwood floor. I wiped my wet face, allowing my eyes to fully adjust to the dim ambient lighting. I was no longer a helpless outsider looking in through the glass. I was standing directly inside his fortress. I pulled my wet coat tighter around my shoulders, my gaze hardening into a look of absolute lethal determination. The midnight message had been perfectly clear. The door under the stairs. I stepped forward into the silent hallway, completely ready to tear down this beautiful house of lies brick by brick to get my daughter back. I crept down the long, winding carpeted hallway of the massive estate, the thick imported Persian rugs completely silencing my wet rubber boots. High above me, the elegant sweeping notes of a live professional string quartet drifted through the sprawling house. They were playing a lively Mozart piece for the dozens of wealthy guests gathered in the grand ballroom. Those elite donors and local politicians were sipping expensive imported champagne and bidding thousands of dollars on charity auction items, completely oblivious to the absolute nightmare breathing just beneath their feet. I reached the grand mahogany staircase. The polished sweeping steps curved upward toward the brilliant crystal light of the party, but my focus was entirely on the suffocating darkness below. I slipped silently into the shadows beneath the grand staircase, pressing my back flat against the cold stone wall. The air down here was heavy, damp, and stale, a sharp, sickening contrast to the rich scents of roasted duck and expensive vanilla designer candles wafting from the nearby catering kitchen. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped wild bird fighting to break free from my chest. I scanned the dim corridor and found the utility closet tucked neatly into a recessed alcove, just as I remembered from the original floor plans. I turned the brass knob and stepped inside the cramped space, my hands desperately searching the wooden shelves in the pitch-black darkness. My frantic fingers brushed against cold, heavy steel. A massive cast-iron pipe wrench. I gripped the thick-textured handle, feeling its solid, brutal weight anchor my trembling hands. This was not just a piece of metal. It was the physical key to taking back my daughter. I moved deeper into the unfinished concrete section of the basement, located directly beneath the heavy foundation of the grand staircase. The soft ambient light from the upper hallway barely reached this far into the gloom. I strained my burning eyes in the darkness until I finally saw it. A heavy, solid steel security door painted a dull industrial gray. It was entirely out of place in this magnificent luxury mansion. It did not look like a storage closet door. It looked exactly like a bank vault, and right in the dead center, a heavy-duty steel padlock secured a thick iron latch, bolted directly into the concrete frame. Someone had intentionally locked this heavy door from the outside. The sheer, calculated cruelty of that image sent a rush of boiling acidic bile straight up into my throat. My baby girl was locked behind that heavy steel. I raised the massive pipe wrench high above my head, gripping the cold iron with both hands. I could not afford to worry about the noise. The string quartet above suddenly hit a soaring dramatic crescendo, the cellos and violins rising in a loud sweeping wave of music. I brought the heavy wrench down with every single ounce of strength in my exhausted, aching body. The steel struck the brass padlock with a deafening, violent crack. The lock held firm. I gasped for air, my vision blurring with pure primal rage. I raised the heavy wrench again. I thought about the sterile, bleak visitation rooms. I thought about the smirking, arrogant face of the paid court supervisor. I thought about Gregory standing before a judge, wearing his custom-tailored suits, telling the court I was mentally unfit. I brought the solid metal down a second time, putting all my maternal fury and years of agonizing pain behind the blow. The heavy brass padlock shattered the metal casing, cracking wide open and clattering loudly onto the cold concrete floor. I yanked the heavy iron latch back and pulled the solid steel door open. The room inside was absolutely tiny, no bigger than a walk-in closet. There were no windows to the outside world. The air inside was suffocatingly hot and smelled strongly of pure fear and stale sweat. A single bare light bulb hung from the low wooden ceiling, casting a harsh, unforgiving yellow glare across the concrete floor. In the far corner, sitting on a bare, thin mattress, was a small, fragile figure, hugging her knees tightly to her chest. Lily, my beautiful, precious little girl. She was wearing a crumpled, oversized gray sweatshirt, her dark hair a tangled, unbrushed mess around her pale face. In her small, trembling hands, she tightly clutched a cheap black burner phone. The moment her wide, terrified eyes met mine, the plastic phone dropped from her grip, hitting the floor. "Mom!" Her voice was a dry, broken rasp that shattered my heart into a million pieces. She scrambled off the bare mattress and threw herself frantically into my open arms. I dropped the heavy iron wrench and caught her, pulling her small, fragile body hard against my chest. We crashed together onto the cold concrete floor, holding each other with a desperate, crushing grip. I buried my face deeply in her messy hair, inhaling the familiar, sweet scent of my child. We did not scream. We did not wail. We held each other tightly and choked back our heavy sobs, knowing that a single loud noise could bring Gregory and his private security guards running down the stairs. Lily was shaking violently, like a delicate leaf caught in a brutal winter storm. I quickly pulled back and ran my trembling hands all over her pale face, her arms, her shoulders, desperately checking for any signs of physical abuse. There were no dark bruises, there were no broken bones, but the absolute pure terror radiating from her wide sunken eyes was a wound far deeper and much more dangerous than any physical strike. I cupped her pale cheeks, my thumbs gently wiping away the hot tears streaming down her dirty face. "Lily, sweetheart." I whispered, my voice trembling with suppressed lethal fury. Who put you in here? How long have you been locked in this dark room? Lily swallowed hard, her small chest heaving rapidly as she tried to catch her breath. Ashley did it. She locked me in here 3 days ago, Mom. 3 days. My blood turned to absolute freezing ice. 3 days in a windowless concrete closet while her wealthy father and beautiful stepmother prepared for a lavish charity gala just upstairs. Why, I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling whisper. Why would she do this to you? Lily looked down at the concrete floor, her voice completely broken and small. She said I was looking too pale and tired. She said I had dark circles under my eyes and that I was going to ruin the beautiful aesthetic of the gala tonight. She told Dad that I needed a timeout so I would not embarrass them in front of the wealthy church donors. And Dad just let her do it. He said a few days in the dark would teach me to smile better for the expensive cameras. The sheer monstrous evil of those words completely paralyzed me. They locked an 11-year-old girl in a basement vault so she would not ruin their perfect Instagram aesthetic. The beautiful, pious Christian family image they sold to the world was a rotting, decaying corpse wrapped in designer silk. But Lily was not just a terrified victim. She was my daughter, and she possessed a brilliant, incredibly brave, observing mind. She reached into the deep pocket of her oversized sweatshirt and pulled out a thick, crumpled stack of folded papers. She shoved the documents desperately into my hands. I sneaked into his home office last week before they locked me up, she whispered quickly. I heard them arguing loudly about missing money, so I waited until they were asleep, and I copied these from his private unlocked safe. I bought the burner phone at school from a friend, and I hid it. I knew you would need these papers to save us, Mom. I took the crumpled papers from her small trembling hands and held them up to the harsh yellow light of the bare bulb. I'm a pediatric nurse by trade, but managing the chaotic schedules and complex supply budgets of a busy hospital ward requires a very sharp, meticulous eye for numbers and discrepancies. As I quickly scanned the first page of the top document, the breath completely left my burning lungs. It was a formal legal asset transfer agreement, dated exactly 6 years ago. The exact same month, Gregory had filed for his aggressive surprise divorce. The document detailed the complete liquidation of my late parents' massive estate. My parents had worked their entire lives to build a highly successful chain of local pharmacies, leaving behind a substantial multi-million-dollar trust fund strictly in my name. The signature at the bottom of the liquidation order was supposed to be mine. But looking closely at the ink strokes, it was a blatant, crude forgery. Gregory had forged my name. He had legally drained my entire family legacy, while I was blindingly grieving their sudden deaths and battling severe postpartum anxiety. My hands began to shake with a new kind of energy as I quickly shuffled to the next page. It was a dense series of corporate bank statements and international wire transfer logs. The bold numbers printed on the pages were absolutely staggering. Millions of dollars had been funneled completely out of my liquidated trust and transferred directly into a private limited liability company, secretly controlled by Gregory. From there, the money was systematically washed straight into the private tax-exempt building fund of Grace Fellowship. That was the massive local megachurch where Gregory's older brother Bradley sat comfortably as the head deacon and primary financial officer. Bradley, the pious, deeply respected deacon who prayed loudly on Sunday mornings and judged the community, was actively laundering my stolen inheritance through his untraceable church accounts, disguising the stolen cash as anonymous philanthropic donations. A crushing, overwhelming wave of realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. The brutal courtroom custody battle, the high-paid psychologists testifying to my so-called mental instability, the heavily supervised sterile weekend visits where I was treated like a criminal. None of it had ever been about Lily. None of it had been about my capability or my profound love as a mother. My supposed mental instability was nothing but a meticulously manufactured legal distraction, a bright, shining smokescreen designed specifically to keep me exhausted, terrified, and buried in family court debt, while Gregory and Bradley quietly stole my entire generational wealth right out from under me. They had used my own child as a weapon to keep me completely distracted from their massive financial fraud. I stared at the forged signature on the paper, the cold reality of their pure, unadulterated evil sinking deeply into my very bones. For 6 agonizing years, I had blindly believed I was a failure. For 6 years, I had apologized to the universe for not being strong enough to keep my family together against a powerful, wealthy man. But looking at these dry, damning numbers, the weeping, broken, submissive nurse inside me finally died. She withered away into the cold concrete floor and was instantly replaced by a calculating, utterly fearless mother who had just been handed the ultimate keys to her enemy's absolute destruction. I carefully folded the heavy stack of documents and placed them securely into the deep inside pocket of my wet trench coat, patting the damp fabric flat against my side. I looked down at my brave, beautiful daughter and gently smoothed her tangled dark hair away from her pale face. I gave her a calm, steady smile that held absolutely no fear, only an absolute lethal promise. "We are leaving right now, Lily?" I said, my voice harder and sharper than steel. "And we are going to burn their beautiful house of lies straight to the ground." I tucked the thick stack of forged documents deep inside my soaked trench coat. The heavy paper pressed against my ribs like a protective shield of solid armor. I gripped Lily by her small, trembling hand. Her fingers were ice cold and practically vibrating with fear. I looked down into her wide, terrified eyes and gave her a single reassuring nod. I pulled her out of that suffocating concrete vault and back into the dim, ambient glow of the sprawling basement. The muffled classical music from the grand ballroom upstairs continued to drift down through the expensive brass air vents. The wealthy donors and corrupt local politicians were still sipping their vintage imported champagne, completely unaware that the foundation of their perfect, elegant night was actively crumbling beneath their expensive leather shoes. I needed a weapon. The heavy iron pipe wrench I used to smash the padlock was too incredibly bulky to carry efficiently. I left it on the concrete floor and scanned the dark utility corridor. My eyes locked onto a heavy-duty tactical flashlight resting on a wooden supply shelf. It was solid black metal, thick and heavy in the center, with a jagged beveled edge around the thick glass lens. I snatched it up with my free hand. The cold, solid metal grounded my racing thoughts. I clicked the power button to ensure it remained off. We moved silently toward the heavy wooden door that led to the private service stairwell, which would take us directly out to the rear gardens. We were exactly 10 feet away from our escape route when the heavy brass handle of the stairwell door suddenly began to turn. A sharp mechanical click echoed through the silent basement. My heart stopped completely. I yanked Lily backward, pressing our bodies flat against the cold concrete wall behind a hot, massive floor-to-ceiling oak wine rack. A bright wedge of golden light spilled down the carpeted stairs, slicing directly into the basement gloom. Heavy, deliberate footsteps began to descend. Click, click, click. The polished sound of expensive Italian leather dress shoes hitting the wooden steps. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped into the dim basement light. It was Bradley, Gregory's older brother, the deeply respected head deacon of Grace Fellowship. He was wearing an immaculate tailored black tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled and slicked back. He held a crystal wineglass in one hand, humming a soft, arrogant tune under his breath. He had come down to the private temperature-controlled cellar to fetch a rare vintage bottle of wine for the VIP guests upstairs. I held my breath. I prayed to God that the deep shadows would completely conceal us, but Lily let out a tiny involuntary gasp. It was barely a whisper of sound, but in the dead silence of the basement, it sounded like a roaring gunshot. Bradley stopped dead in his tracks. His arrogant humming ceased immediately. He turned his head slowly, his cold, pale blue eyes scanning the dark corners of the basement. He took 2 deliberate steps toward the wine rack. Then he saw the puddle of water dripping from my soaked trench coat. "Well, look exactly what the rain washed in," Bradley said. His voice was a low, mocking drawl dripping with absolute condescension. He set his crystal wineglass down on a wooden barrel and took another confident step toward us. The loving, devoted church deacon persona instantly vanished completely, replaced by the ruthless, calculating predator I always knew lurked beneath his pious Sunday smile. "You really are completely out of your mind, Evelyn. Breaking and entering, trespassing on private property, and now attempting to kidnap a minor from her legal guardian. You just handed Gregory the absolute perfect excuse to lock you inside a psychiatric ward for the rest of your miserable natural life. I stepped out from behind the wine rack, positioning my body entirely between Bradley and my terrified daughter. I kept the heavy tactical flashlight hidden slightly behind my right thigh. Bradley let out a short, cruel laugh, echoing loudly in the damp cellar. "You look absolutely pathetic, Evelyn. Look at you, standing in a puddle of muddy water in my brother's house, wearing cheap hospital scrubs. Do you honestly think you can just walk out of here with her? Gregory has a signed court order granting him sole absolute custody. The family court judge eats dinner at my house every other Sunday. The chief of police serves on my personal community advisory board. If I make one single phone call right now, you will be in cold steel handcuffs before you even reach the end of the long driveway." I stared at him. The sheer blinding arrogance radiating from his pores was absolutely sickening. For 6 agonizing years, this man had stood at a church pulpit preaching about honesty and salvation while actively funneling millions of stolen dollars from my dead parents' estate into his personal offshore accounts. He had helped his brother orchestrate my complete mental and financial destruction. He had fully supported locking an 11-year-old girl in a windowless concrete closet just so her sad presence would not ruin their perfect aesthetic party. The old Evelyn, the exhausted, terrified pediatric nurse who constantly apologized and backed down, simply ceased to exist in that exact moment. The submissive, enduring mother died right there on the cold basement floor. In her place, a violently protective and highly calculating force took absolute control of my mind and body. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not engage in a loud, meaningless argument with a man who viewed me as nothing more than an annoying insect waiting to be crushed. Bradley took another aggressive step forward, reaching out with his large manicured hand to grab my shoulder. "Come here, you crazy woman," he snarled. "I am calling the private security team right now, and they are going to drag you out of here by your hair." He fully expected me to cower. He fully expected me to shrink away and beg for mercy, just like I always did during the grueling, intimidating divorce depositions. But my years of intense medical training kicked in with absolute brutal precision. As a pediatric surgical nurse, I know the human body intimately. I know exactly where the major arteries flow. I know exactly how the skeletal structure connects. And I know exactly where the most vulnerable, unprotected nerve clusters are located right beneath the surface of the skin. As his hand reached aggressively toward my collarbone, I pivoted sharply on my left heel, shifting my entire body weight forward with massive momentum. I brought my right arm up in a lightning-fast, completely silent arc. I did not swing wildly or blindly. I aimed with absolute surgical precision. The heavy, jagged metal edge of the tactical flashlight struck Bradley directly on the side of his thick neck, hitting the exact location of the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus is a massive, dense network of nerves that completely controls the vital signals from the spinal cord to the shoulder, arm, and hand. A heavy, concentrated, blunt force strike to that exact anatomical bundle causes immediate catastrophic pain and instant temporary paralysis. The solid metal edge connected with his flesh, producing a sickening, dull thud. Bradley did not even have the time to scream or process what had just happened. The massive shockwave of the precise strike short-circuited his nervous system instantly. His pale blue eyes rolled violently back into his skull. The arrogant, smug sneer was wiped completely off his face in a fraction of a second. His strong legs instantly turned to absolute jelly. He collapsed forward, dropping like a heavy sack of wet cement. His massive body hit the concrete floor with a heavy, muffled thud, completely incapacitated and completely silent. He lay there, twitching slightly in the dim light, the great, powerful head deacon reduced to a crumpled, drooling heap on the cellar floor. I did not waste a single second looking down at his unconscious body. I grabbed Lily's hand, holding it in a vice-like grip. "Run!" I whispered sharply. We bolted for the heavy wooden service door at the end of the hall. I pushed the brass lever and shoved the door open. The freezing torrential rain hit us immediately, washing over my face and completely soaking Lily in seconds. We plunged blindly into the dark, turbulent storm, leaving the warm, glowing mansion behind us. We sprinted across the perfectly manicured, sprawling lawns, our feet sinking deeply into the expensive imported mud. I could hear the loud, erratic splashing of our rapid footsteps, but the roaring thunder from the dark sky above perfectly masked the sound. We kept our heads down, weaving frantically through the thick row of massive oak trees that lined the perimeter of the sprawling estate. The cold, biting wind howled violently, tearing at my heavy trench coat, but the sheer rushing adrenaline pumping through my heart kept me entirely focused. We had to get to my car. We had to disappear into the chaotic city before the armed security patrol discovered Bradley's unconscious body bleeding in the basement. My chest burned with every frantic breath as we pushed through the thick landscaping. Lily stumbled once in the slippery mud, but I pulled her up instantly, never breaking our forward stride. The freezing rain plastered my hair to my face, blinding my vision, but I memorized the path when I first arrived. We were so incredibly close to the outer boundary. As we reached the towering wrought iron gate at the very edge of the property, my absolute worst fear materialized. A deafening high-pitched siren suddenly ripped through the stormy night air. The automated mansion security alarms had finally tripped. Brilliant, flashing strobe lights illuminated the massive stone house behind us, cutting sharply through the thick, blinding sheets of rain. I could hear the frantic shouting of the valet attendants drifting over the wind and the heavy boots of the private security guards hitting the pavement. They had found the broken vault padlock. They had found Bradley bleeding on the wine cellar floor. The entire luxury estate was now in absolute total lockdown. We squeezed desperately through a narrow, muddy gap in the thick hedge boundary, tumbling out onto the dark, deserted public road just as sweeping flashlight beams began to scan the very trees we had just run through. I pulled Lily up from the wet, abrasive asphalt, and we ran the final 2 exhausting blocks to where I had hidden my old sedan in the shadows of the construction site. I threw the heavy car door open, shoved Lily safely into the passenger seat, and quickly climbed behind the steering wheel. My wet hands were shaking so terribly I could barely turn the ignition key, but the old reliable engine finally roared to life. I slammed my muddy foot on the gas pedal, tearing violently away from the dark curb and speeding down the empty street without turning my headlights on until we were miles away from the affluent, guarded neighborhood. As the flashing security lights of the massive mansion completely disappeared in my rearview mirror, a heavy, terrifying reality settled permanently over my mind. We were now officially fugitives on the run. I had just assaulted a highly respected public religious figure. I had taken a child against a strict legal court order. Gregory had unlimited stolen money. He had powerful, untarnished social standing. He had an army of vicious, highly paid lawyers, and he had the entire local police force sitting comfortably in his back pocket. I was a broke, exhausted pediatric nurse with a stolen car and a terrified, wet child. But as I reached inside my soaked trench coat and felt the thick, crumpled stack of forged financial documents pressing warmly against my chest, a cold, calculated smile slowly spread across my wet face. Gregory thought he held all the power in the world. He thought he could bury me alive in court and keep my daughter as a silent aesthetic prop for his fake luxury life. But he had absolutely no idea that I was currently driving away in the dark with the absolute undeniable forensic proof of his massive federal crimes. The war had just escalated to a level he could not comprehend, and I was fully prepared to burn his entire empire to the absolute ground. I drove through the punishing black storm with my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my joints ached with a dull throbbing pain. The intense adrenaline that had propelled me out of Gregory's massive estate and through the freezing mud was slowly burning off, leaving behind a cold, terrifying clarity. Lily sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, wrapped tightly in my damp trench coat. She was staring blankly out the passenger window at the dark, blurring trees, her small body shivering uncontrollably. I wanted to drive straight to the local police precinct. Every natural maternal instinct inside my brain screamed at me to run into a brightly lit lobby, demand to see a detective, and slam the stolen, forged financial documents onto the nearest desk. But my medical training and my agonizing years of surviving Gregory's psychological warfare forced my mind to process the grim, undeniable reality of our situation. I absolutely could not go to the local authorities. The chief of police in our wealthy county was a regular at Bradley's massive megachurch. He sat in the premium front pews every single Sunday morning. He attended Gregory's lavish catered golf tournaments and happily accepted his massive campaign donations. If I walked into that precinct, I would not be treated as a desperate whistleblower protecting a child. I would be instantly detained in a cold holding cell while the chief made a quiet, discreet phone call to my powerful ex-husband. I would be formally arrested for kidnapping a minor, and Lily would be shoved right back into that suffocating concrete closet before the sun even cleared the horizon. I had to get completely out of the state. I kept the headlights low and merged onto the deserted interstate, heading north into the violent storm. I desperately needed a sanctuary that Gregory's immense wealth and social influence could not easily reach. My mind frantically raced through a catalogue of old college friends and distant family relatives, but they were all completely compromised. Gregory had systematically isolated me from everyone during our bitter divorce, poisoning their opinions with his manufactured tales of my mental instability. There was only one person left in the world who truly owed me his life and who possessed the exact forensic skills I desperately needed tonight. Harrison. 5 years ago, during a brutal, understaffed winter shift at the hospital pediatric intensive care unit, I was assigned to a severely ill 7-year-old boy, suffering from a rare aggressive respiratory infection. The boy's grandfather was Harrison, a fiercely protective retired agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation who had spent 30 long years hunting down ruthless corporate financial criminals. While the other nurses and doctors were deeply intimidated by his sharp, demanding demeanor, I stayed by his grandson's bed for 3 days straight, refusing to sleep or leave the room until the dangerous fever finally broke. Harrison had looked me dead in the eye the morning they finally discharged his grandson and handed me a heavy brass coin with his personal phone number engraved on the back. He told me that if the universe ever cornered me and I had absolutely nowhere else to turn, I was to call him. The universe had just backed me into an absolute dead end. It took 4 grueling, terrifying hours of navigating slick, treacherous backroads to finally cross the state line. The violent thunderstorm gradually faded into a heavy, freezing drizzle by the time my tired tires crunched onto the hidden gravel driveway of Harrison's remote woodland property. The large wooden cabin was completely isolated, surrounded by acres of dense, towering pine trees that deliberately blocked out the rest of the world. It was a true off-the-grid bunker, built by a man who knew exactly how to hide. Before I even shifted the car into park, the heavy, solid oak front door of the cabin swung wide open. Harrison stood on the wooden porch completely unfazed by the freezing rain blowing against his face. He wore a thick, faded flannel shirt and held a heavy black shotgun resting casually against his side. His sharp, assessing eyes locked immediately onto my exhausted face through the wet windshield. I killed the engine and hurried around to the passenger side, pulling my trembling daughter into my arms. We stumbled up the wooden steps, shivering so violently my teeth were audibly chattering. Harrison did not ask a single meaningless question. He did not demand an explanation or scold me for arriving in the dead of night. He took one long analytical look at my soaking wet hospital scrubs and the sheer absolute terror radiating from my daughter's pale face, and he immediately stepped aside to let us cross the threshold. The inside of the cabin was fiercely warm, smelling deeply of burning cedar and strong black coffee. Harrison quickly locked the heavy deadbolt behind us and secured a thick iron bar across the sturdy doorframe. He gently guided Lily to a worn leather sofa near the roaring stone fireplace and handed her a thick woven woolen blanket. I stood in the center of the room, trembling violently as the freezing rainwater dripped heavily from my tangled hair onto the rustic rug. Harrison poured a large mug of steaming hot coffee and pressed it firmly into my shaking hands. He looked at me with those piercing analytical eyes that had broken down countless white-collar criminals and calmly told me to drink and breathe. He said we were entirely, completely safe inside these walls and that no local sheriff or private security team would ever dare cross his property line without facing a massive federal problem. For the first time in 6 excruciating years, I allowed myself to take a true deep breath. The suffocating, crushing weight of Gregory's power could not reach through the thick wooden walls of this sanctuary. I sat down heavily on a wooden dining chair, pulling the thick, crumpled stack of wet financial documents from my trench coat and laid them carefully on the table. We sat quietly by the warm fire while the dark sky outside slowly turned a pale, bruising gray. Lily had finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep on the leather sofa, her small fingers still clutching the edge of the woolen blanket for safety. Harrison had spent the last 2 hours silently reviewing the damp papers I had laid on his table. His expression grew darker and more rigid with every single page he turned. He instantly recognized the sheer magnitude of the offshore transfers, the fake corporate accounts, and the blatant crude forgery of my signature. But before we could begin formulating a coherent plan, the quiet safety of the cabin was violently shattered by a harsh, shrill tone. It was the emergency broadcast system. Harrison reached over and turned on the small television sitting on his kitchen counter. The morning local news was completely dominated by a massive breaking story. A glaring red-amber alert flashed aggressively across the bottom of the television screen, displaying an old-school photograph of Lily alongside my full legal name and my outdated license plate number. The news anchor looked gravely into the camera and announced that a dangerous, mentally unstable woman had violently assaulted a prominent church leader and completely abducted an 11-year-old girl from a charity gala. The screen suddenly cut to a live press conference taking place on the pristine front lawn of Gregory's sprawling estate. My stomach churned with pure acidic disgust as I watched my ex-husband stand confidently behind a cluster of local news microphones. He looked perfectly disheveled, wearing a slightly wrinkled suit jacket and no tie, playing the dramatic role of the devastated, terrified father with absolute sickening perfection. He looked directly into the news cameras and begged with fake crystal-clear tears pooling in his eyes. He said he just wanted his sick, confused ex-wife to bring his beautiful daughter home safely so she could get the psychiatric medical help she desperately needed. Standing right beside him was Ashley, clinging dramatically to his arm for support. She wore absolutely no makeup and a plain, dark, oversized sweater burying her face in his shoulder and sobbing loudly about how she just wanted her beloved, sweet stepdaughter back in her arms. Watching them perform for the flashing cameras made the blood in my veins run boiling hot. They were brilliantly and ruthlessly manipulating the media using my fabricated medical history to paint me as a deranged, violent kidnapper. They had completely cornered me in the most visible public way possible. Every highway patrol officer, every gas station attendant, and every concerned citizen in the country was now actively hunting me down. Gregory had effectively mobilized the entire world to do his dirty work. He knew that if I was caught, the police would immediately return Lily to the concrete closet under the stairs, and I would be thrown into a maximum security psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. The stolen documents in my pocket would be completely dismissed as the paranoid, fabricated ravings of a madwoman. It was a flawlessly designed, brutal legal trap, and the walls were rapidly closing in. Harrison muted the television and turned to face me. The heavy silence in the cabin felt incredibly loud. He crossed his arms over his chest and delivered the brutal, unvarnished truth. He told me that Gregory had completely controlled the narrative and heavily owned the local judicial system. He said the forged documents I brought were incredibly powerful, but proving a massive ecclesiastical money laundering scheme would take months of complex federal investigation. Right now, in the eyes of the law, I was nothing but a dangerous fugitive who had attacked a respected deacon. Harrison walked over to a hidden floor safe beneath the rug and pulled out a thick envelope of untraceable cash and a set of blank passports. He looked at me with genuine, sincere concern and told me that my only viable option was to take the money-packed Lily into his untraceable hunting truck and run straight across the remote Canadian border before the state troopers set up a permanent blockade. He told me to completely disappear and start a new life where Gregory could never, ever find us. I sat perfectly still listening to the popping embers in the stone fireplace. I looked over at my beautiful sleeping daughter, who had endured 6 long years of emotional torture, simply because I was too weak and submissive to fight back. I looked at the thick stack of financial documents resting on the wooden table, representing my entire stolen generational legacy. Then I looked back at the television screen, where Gregory's smug, arrogant face was silently crying fake tears for the gullible public. A sudden, profound, and violent transformation occurred deep within my soul. The terrified, weeping nurse who had driven through the violent thunderstorm completely evaporated into nothingness. I slowly stood up from the wooden chair, pushing the thick envelope of escape money back across the table toward Harrison. I reached up and wiped the last remaining tear from my cheek, my hand steady and sure. My posture straightened completely, my shoulders pulling back as a cold, calculating, and utterly fearless energy filled the quiet room. I am not running, Harrison, I said, my voice dropping to a low, chillingly steady tone. For 6 years, I played the role of the defeated, submissive victim because I genuinely believed he held all the power in the world. I allowed him to steal my parents' legacy and lock my only child in the dark because I was paralyzed by the fear of his lawyers and his fake social standing. But I am absolutely done running from him. I walked over to the table and tapped my index finger sharply against the stack of forged bank transfers. Gregory thinks he has completely trapped me by putting my face on the national news, but he just made his final fatal mistake. He forced me completely into a corner where I have absolutely nothing left to lose. I am going to completely dismantle their entire fake empire from the inside out. I am going to bleed every single one of his hidden offshore accounts completely dry, and I am going to expose his precious church as a criminal enterprise. I looked Harrison dead in the eye, radiating absolute undeniable authority. I know you still have your high-level forensic accounting contacts at the Bureau. I need you to help me trace these routing numbers and fully crack his digital security protocols. Will you help me destroy him? Harrison stared at me for a long, heavy moment, a slow, fierce smile finally breaking across his weathered face. He reached under the table, pulled out a secure encrypted laptop, and set it firmly beside the documents. "Let us get to work," he said. The hunt was officially on. The heavy steel door of Harrison's underground bunker sealed us off completely from the chaotic and dangerous world above. The thick metal hinges locked into place with a resounding final thud, effectively cutting us off from the howling, violent thunderstorm that continued to batter the remote woodland cabin. For exactly 72 excruciating hours, the only sounds in the damp concrete room were the low, relentless hum of high-powered computer servers and the sharp, aggressive scratching of red, dry erase markers against a massive whiteboard. We had literally descended into the dark belly of his isolated, off-the-grid property, trading a desperate physical fight for survival, for an incredibly intense and grueling intellectual war. I sat frozen in a rigid, uncomfortable metal chair completely surrounded by a mountain of empty foam coffee cups and cold, discarded takeout boxes. The sheer physical exhaustion I used to feel from my 14-hour pediatric nursing shifts paled in comparison to the absolute mental drain of dissecting Gregory's massive financial crimes. My entire body ached, and my eyes burned intensely from staring at the bright, glowing screens, but I absolutely refused to sleep. I refused to close my eyes for even a single second. Every single time my vision began to blur or my shoulders began to slump, I simply looked over at the small surveillance monitor sitting on the edge of the metal desk. The black and white feed displayed the upstairs guest bedroom where my daughter Lily was sleeping soundly under a thick woven quilt. The dark, terrified circles under her eyes, the ones Ashley had cruelly locked her in a closet for having, were slowly beginning to fade. She was finally safe. She was finally breathing without the constant suffocating fear of her father's anger. Seeing her small chest rise and fall in the quiet room gave me an endless supply of cold, calculated adrenaline. I wiped my face, running my hands through my tangled damp hair, and turned my entire focus back to the crumpled damp documents Lily had bravely smuggled out of Gregory's home office. Harrison sat directly across from me, his deeply weathered face sharply illuminated by the harsh blue light of 3 separate computer monitors. Despite being retired for several years, the former federal agent still possessed the sharp predatory instincts of a man who spent his entire career hunting down wealthy, ruthless white-collar criminals. Together, we meticulously flattened out every single stolen page on the wide, cold steel table. I am a pediatric nurse by trade, but managing the chaotic schedules, complex supply budgets, and critical medication charts of a busy hospital ward requires a highly analytical and extremely disciplined mind. I treated Gregory's heavily coded financial ledgers exactly like a critical patient chart. I systematically isolated the unusual symptoms. I meticulously tracked the internal bleeding. I searched relentlessly for the absolute root cause of the disease that had destroyed my family. We spent hours typing complex routing numbers into Harrison's secure encrypted federal database, tracking the massive sums of money that had been illegally drained from my late parents' estate. The sheer terrifying scale of Gregory's betrayal was absolutely staggering. He had not simply taken the money and run. He had run the stolen funds through a complex, sophisticated web of domestic shadow corporations, effectively slicing the massive trust fund into thousands of smaller, untraceable digital transactions. I stared at the stark white numbers scrolling rapidly on the glowing screen, feeling a violent wave of acidic bile rise sharply in my throat. This was the exact money my parents had saved for decades. This was the proud legacy they built by working grueling 16-hour days at their local pharmacies, carefully saving every penny to ensure I had a secure future. And Gregory had callously, maliciously stolen it, using my manufactured mental instability as a perfect, airtight legal smokescreen to distract the family court judges. But Gregory was far too arrogant and far too greedy to simply hide the stolen money in a quiet account. He wanted to actively use it to build a massive public empire of false piety and immense untouchable social power. On the second long night of our relentless investigation, Harrison finally cracked the complex encryption on a series of heavily redacted offshore bank statements. He quickly printed the pages and laid them out flat in front of me, tapping the paper with a heavy pen. "Look closely at the domestic entry points," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that echoed in the concrete bunker. "The money is not going directly to the Cayman Islands. It is being aggressively washed right here in the city of Chicago before it ever leaves the country." I leaned heavily over the table, tracing the highlighted accounting columns with my trembling index finger. Every single stolen dollar was being routed directly into the operational business accounts of a highly publicized corporate charity organization called the Family Values Foundation. My blood ran absolutely freezing cold. The Family Values Foundation was Ashley's crowning glory. It was the exact high-profile charity she promoted relentlessly on her perfectly curated, perfectly filtered social media channels. She constantly posed in custom expensive designer gowns, handing out giant novelty cardboard checks to local community orphanages while broadcasting her supposedly deep, unyielding Christian faith to millions of gullible, adoring followers. She actively used the foundation to secure elite social status and to broker highly lucrative corporate brand sponsorships with major national retailers. The sickening, horrifying reality hit me with the sheer force of a physical blow to the chest. The entire glamorous foundation was nothing but a massive, elaborate, criminal shell company. I quickly pulled up the public tax records for Ashley's charity on my laptop and cross-referenced them directly with the stolen ledgers Lily had provided. The massive charitable donations Ashley publicly claimed to collect from wealthy anonymous donors were a complete total fabrication. The money funding her lavish high society galas, her extensive designer wardrobe, and her luxury aesthetic lifestyle was entirely composed of my parents' stolen inheritance. But the money laundering scheme required a massive legitimate institutional front to completely avoid routine federal tax audits. I frantically searched the corporate filing documents, looking for the foundation's official board of directors. There, sitting proudly at the very top of the executive board list, was Bradley, Gregory's older brother, the deeply respected, highly influential, and powerful head deacon of Grace Fellowship. I gripped the sharp edge of the steel table so tightly, my knuckles turned a stark bone white, my nails digging painfully into my own palms. Bradley was actively maliciously using his immense, unquestioned authority within the massive megachurch to officially sign off on massive fraudulent charitable tax exemptions. He was legally washing Gregory's dirty stolen money directly through the church building fund, cleaning the illicit cash under the absolute flawless guise of religious philanthropy. The absolute blinding hypocrisy of these men was utterly staggering and deeply vile. For 6 long years, they had stood proudly at the polished wooden pulpit every single Sunday morning, demanding heavy financial tithes from hard-working innocent families and preaching loudly about honesty, strict morality, and divine salvation. Behind their heavy closed oak doors, they were running a highly sophisticated criminal syndicate. They had successfully convinced a family court judge that I was an unfit, hysterical mother while they actively used the Holy Church to launder millions of stolen dollars. They had cruelly locked my 11-year-old daughter in a windowless concrete closet to preserve their perfect party aesthetic, while they systematically robbed her of her entire future and her rightful legacy. I did not shed a single tear. My eyes were completely bone dry. The fragile, weeping, submissive woman who had spent 6 years apologizing to the universe for failing her daughter was completely, totally dead. The woman currently sitting in that underground bunker was a lethal, highly focused, and incredibly dangerous threat. I looked directly at Harrison with a gaze as sharp and cold as a surgeon's scalpel. "We have them," I stated, my voice perfectly steady and utterly devoid of fear. "We have the exact undeniable paper trail proving massive corporate racketeering, interstate wire fraud, and federal tax evasion. We just need to hand this thick file over to your trusted contacts at the Federal Bureau, and they will all be in heavy steel handcuffs by tomorrow morning." Harrison slowly shook his head, his deep-set eyes filled with a grim, heavy frustration. "It is not that simple, Evelyn," he replied, leaning back heavily in his metal chair and crossing his arms. "We have the routing numbers, and we have the exact names of the fake shell companies. But Gregory is a highly seasoned, aggressive wealth manager. He knows exactly how to build impenetrable digital walls." Harrison pointed a calloused finger to a blinking red prompt flashing aggressively on his center computer monitor. "The bulk of the stolen money, the $14 million that forms the absolute financial foundation of their entire luxurious wealth, is currently sitting locked in a highly secure encrypted offshore account in the Cayman Islands. In order to legally freeze those specific funds and present a truly bulletproof, undeniable case to a federal judge, we desperately need the digital master keys. We need the original cryptographic security tokens that Gregory personally uses to authenticate and approve these massive international transfers. Without those exact master keys, the federal prosecutors will say this stolen written ledger is just a piece of highly circumstantial paper. Gregory's high-powered, expensive defense attorneys will easily successfully argue that the physical documents were entirely doctored by a bitter, unstable, jealous ex-wife who simply wants revenge. We absolutely cannot strike until we physically hold the master keys. We cannot give them a single inch of legal breathing room, or they will instantly move the money and completely destroy the evidence. My heart hammered painfully and rapidly against my ribs. "Where are the master keys?" I asked, my voice tense with an urgent, fierce determination. "Where does he keep the digital tokens?" Harrison quickly began typing complex, rapid command codes into his dark terminal. If Gregory is moving this much liquid cash on a weekly basis to avoid detection, he absolutely cannot rely on a standard commercial cloud server. He heavily needs a dedicated physical hardware server, a private, highly encrypted local network that strictly requires a direct physical manual login. Harrison ran a highly sophisticated federal digital trace analyzing the exact IP addresses of the daily ping requests sent to the offshore Cayman accounts. The glowing green text cascaded rapidly down the dark monitor screen as the tracking software frantically hunted for the exact physical geographical location of Gregory's master server. I held my breath, waiting for the precise coordinates to lock in. I fully expected the massive server to be buried deep inside the high-security vault of his downtown corporate real estate office, or hidden cleverly beneath the sprawling, polished floors of Bradley's massive megachurch. A loud, sharp electronic beep suddenly echoed loudly through the damp concrete bunker. The tracking software had finally successfully locked onto a fixed physical address. Harrison pulled up a detailed, high-resolution satellite map of downtown Chicago, zooming in rapidly on the highly affluent, incredibly expensive high-end shopping district of the Magnificent Mile. The glowing red target sat directly and perfectly over a sprawling, beautiful commercial retail building. I stared blankly at the address on the screen, my mind racing furiously to connect the impossible dots. It was not Gregory's corporate headquarters. It was not the church. The master server, the absolute digital beating heart of their entire vast criminal empire, was located directly inside Ashley's luxury lifestyle boutique. The exact same highly publicized boutique where she sold ridiculously overpriced organic skincare, imported silk loungewear, and exclusive crystal home decor to the city's absolute wealthiest elite. The sheer, arrogant, brilliant audacity of the hiding spot made my stomach physically churn. No federal auditor or suspicious police detective would ever think to look for a massive, highly illegal financial money laundering server inside a pastel pink, brightly lit boutique that smelled heavily of imported lavender and fresh rosewater. Ashley was actively using her superficial vapid pageant queen persona as the ultimate flawless cover for a high-tech, ruthless criminal operation. Harrison quickly brought up the detailed architectural blueprints of the commercial retail building using his old active federal clearance codes. The luxury boutique was massive, occupying 2 full floors of premium expensive retail space. The front of the store was a wide-open, airy showroom filled with expensive, beautiful merchandise and bright natural sunlight. But the intricate blueprints revealed a highly secure, heavily restricted back office located completely off the main showroom floor. "The server is locked inside that back room," Harrison said, pointing firmly to a small reinforced square on the digital map. "It has a dedicated underground fiber optic line and a heavy complex biometric security lock on the door. You absolutely cannot hack this specific server from the outside, Evelyn. The digital firewall is strictly military grade. The only possible way to get those crucial master keys and completely freeze their entire stolen fortune is to physically walk directly into that restricted back office plug, a cloned hard drive, directly into the server port, and manually download the cryptographic tokens." It was a massive, seemingly impenetrable roadblock designed to keep anyone from ever discovering the truth. Gregory and Ashley genuinely believed their immense wealth was absolutely untouchable. They firmly believed they had brilliantly outsmarted the complex legal system, the federal government, and the pathetic submissive mother they had completely discarded and mocked. They were currently sleeping comfortably in their sprawling warm mansion while their faces completely dominated the morning news, portraying themselves as the tragic, weeping victims of a deranged, violent kidnapper. They felt entirely arrogant. They felt completely, incredibly invincible, but they severely, grossly underestimated the profound, lethal power of a mother who had finally stopped playing by their twisted rules. I stared intently at the glowing blueprints of the luxury boutique, memorizing every single physical exit, every dark service corridor, and every single camera blind spot. The terrified, fleeing nurse was gone forever, and she was never coming back. I was going to walk directly and fearlessly into the luxurious belly of the beast. I was going to completely dismantle their glamorous, fraudulent life from the inside out, and I was going to burn their entire empire to the absolute ground. I stood in the tiny, rust-stained bathroom of Harrison's remote woodland cabin and stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. The exhausted, terrified pediatric nurse looking back at me had to die right there in that small, damp room. I picked up a pair of heavy iron kitchen shears and grabbed a large fistful of my long brown hair. Without a single second of hesitation, I ruthlessly chopped it all off, letting the long, wet strands fall onto the worn linoleum floor. I cut it into a sharp, severe angled bob. Harrison had provided a box of harsh industrial-grade platinum blonde hair, bleach from his emergency supply cache. I mixed the chemicals and applied the thick paste directly to my scalp. The intense chemical burn was incredibly painful, but the sharp burning sensation was deeply grounding. It stripped away the last remaining layers of my submissive, enduring identity. When I washed the harsh chemicals down the drain, my hair was a stark, icy blonde. Harrison handed me a heavy garment bag left behind from one of his old federal undercover sting operations. I slipped into a flawless, tailored white designer coat, pairing it with sleek black trousers and a pair of massive dark Chanel sunglasses that completely obscured the upper half of my face. I applied a thick coat of bold red lipstick. I looked absolutely nothing like the quiet, modest mother Gregory had spent 6 years destroying in family court. I looked exactly like the kind of arrogant, wealthy woman Ashley desperately catered to at her high society events. Before leaving the absolute safety of the cabin, I checked the local morning news broadcast on my phone. The screen displayed a live feed from downtown Chicago. Ashley was standing directly outside the Central Police Precinct, completely surrounded by a massive swarm of flashing press cameras and eager reporters. She was putting on a sickeningly flawless performance. She was sobbing loudly into the microphones, dramatically wiping away completely non-existent tears and begging the public to please help find her missing stepdaughter. She claimed she could not sleep or eat because her heart was entirely broken by my terrible, violent actions. The sheer unadulterated hypocrisy of her performance made the acidic bile rise hot and sharp in my throat. Just 3 days ago, she had cruelly locked my 11-year-old daughter in a windowless concrete basement closet simply because my child had dark circles under her eyes and threatened to ruin the visual aesthetic of their luxury charity gala. Now she was using my daughter's disappearance to garner millions of views and massive public sympathy on national television. I turned the phone off and slipped it into my deep coat pocket. Her highly publicized fake weeping meant she was completely pinned down at the police station, surrounded by media giving me the exact perfect window of opportunity I needed to strike the heart of their criminal empire. I drove Harrison's untraceable dark SUV back across the state line and straight into the bustling heart of the downtown Chicago shopping district. The heavy freezing rain from the previous night had finally stopped, leaving the city streets damp and gray. I parked the vehicle 3 blocks away from the Magnificent Mile and walked briskly toward Ashley's incredibly famous luxury lifestyle boutique. The store was a massive sprawling monument to the millions of dollars they had ruthlessly stolen from my late parents' estate. The building featured towering, pristine glass windows, displaying ridiculously overpriced organic skincare, imported silk loungewear, and exclusive crystal home decor. Today, the boutique was hosting a massive, highly publicized weekend trunk show. The wide sidewalk in front of the store was absolutely packed with private valets rushing to park expensive luxury vehicles. Wealthy elite women dripping in heavy furs and massive diamonds were crowding through the wide double doors. I pulled my dark, oversized sunglasses up, the bridge of my nose tightened the belt of my tailored white coat, and walked straight into the chaotic, crowded showroom. The air inside the boutique was thick and suffocating, smelling heavily of expensive imported lavender and fresh rosewater. The showroom was an absolute madhouse of loud, overlapping conversations and ringing cash registers. Eager sales associates, dressed in matching pastel pink uniforms, were rushing frantically across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays lined with crystal flutes of expensive champagne. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing tray and completely blended into the massive crowd of wealthy elite shoppers. I kept my posture rigidly straight, radiating an aura of cold, absolute entitlement. Several sales associates attempted to approach me, but I simply offered them a sharp, dismissive glare that instantly sent them scurrying away to bother other customers. I moved slowly and deliberately through the crowded showroom, keeping my eyes completely focused on the back wall of the sprawling boutique. Harrison had provided me with the highly classified architectural blueprints of the retail space during our long, intense night in the bunker. I knew exactly where I needed to go. I bypassed the crowded velvet fitting rooms and glided smoothly down a narrow, dimly lit side corridor, designated strictly for authorized employees. At the very end of the quiet hallway was a heavy, solid oak door featuring a frosted glass panel. This was Ashley's private executive back office, and more importantly, it was the exact physical location of the heavily encrypted master server that controlled every single stolen dollar of their massive offshore fortune. I stepped up to the thick wooden door and examined the complex biometric security scanner mounted directly to the wall. Gregory was a deeply arrogant man, but he was not stupid when it came to protecting his stolen wealth. The digital firewall protecting this specific server was strictly military grade. I could not simply hack it from a remote location. I had to physically infiltrate this room and directly access the master terminal. Harrison had utilized his vast federal resources to create a specialized silicone thumbprint overlay, pulled directly from a massive digital database of Gregory's old corporate filings. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thin, transparent silicone patch, carefully pressing it over my own right thumb. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I pressed the silicone overlay directly against the glowing green glass of the biometric scanner. The digital machine beeped softly, processing the complex fingerprint data. I held my breath, praying the federal fabrication would hold up against Gregory's expensive security measures. A sharp mechanical click echoed loudly in the empty corridor, followed immediately by a solid green light flashing across the security panel. The heavy internal deadbolt retracted perfectly. I grabbed the brass handle, pushed the solid oak door open, and slipped silently into the dark office, closing and locking the door firmly behind me. The atmosphere inside the private executive office was a shocking absolute contrast to the bright, warm pastel showroom outside. The room was freezing cold, heavily air-conditioned to protect the massive towering black hardware server sitting securely inside a reinforced steel cage in the far corner of the room. The thick server racks hummed with a low, aggressive, vibrating energy. This was the dark, hidden belly of the beast. This machine actively processed the millions of dollars funneled through the fake family charity and washed perfectly clean by Bradley's corrupt megachurch building fund. I walked directly over to the humming black tower and pulled a specialized heavy-duty cloned hard drive from my deep coat pocket. The device was heavily modified by Harrison, specifically designed to violently rip the digital master keys and cryptographic security tokens directly from Gregory's private network. I plugged the thick black cable directly into the primary master port of the server. A small digital monitor mounted to the side of the steel rack instantly flickered to life, displaying a complex cascade of highly encrypted green code. I swiftly typed in the sequence of forced extraction commands Harrison had meticulously taught me the night before. A thick, glowing progress bar appeared in the center of the dark screen. 10%. The extraction process was agonizingly incredibly slow. The sheer massive volume of the stolen data was absolutely staggering. I stood frozen in the freezing air-conditioned room, watching the names of dozens of fake offshore shell companies and fraudulent international wire transfers flash rapidly across the small screen. 20%. I could hear the muffled, chaotic sounds of the busy trunk show filtering through the heavy oak door. The loud laughter of the wealthy women drinking champagne, directly funded by my late parents' grueling life work, made the hot blood in my veins boil, with a violent protective rage. 30%. I checked the heavy gold watch on my wrist. I had calculated exactly 1 hour of complete safety while Ashley continued her fake weeping performance for the local news stations outside the downtown police precinct. 40%. The low, aggressive hum of the cooling fans inside the server tower seemed to grow overwhelmingly loud in the dark, confined space. 50%. Every single second that ticked by felt like an absolute agonizing eternity. My entire body was rigid with extreme physical tension. If I was caught inside this restricted room, I would immediately be arrested for felony corporate espionage, and Gregory would instantly transfer every single dollar out of his accounts before I could ever secure a federal warrant. 60%. I paced the short length of the freezing room, keeping my eyes entirely locked on the slowly creeping green progress bar. 70%. I thought about Lily locked inside that terrifying windowless concrete closet for 3 days, simply because she ruined her stepmother's fake internet aesthetic. I thought about the total, absolute destruction I was about to rain down upon their entire perfectly curated lives. 80%. The digital keys were almost entirely secured. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to yank the physical hard drive from the port and disappear cleanly out the back service exit. 85%. Suddenly, a loud, sharp mechanical bell echoed violently through the thick walls of the private office. It was the distinct, heavy sound of the private VIP elevator arriving at the end of the employee corridor. The heavy steel elevator doors slid open with a loud metallic scrape. My heart completely stopped beating. I froze in the center of the dark room, the breath entirely trapped in my burning lungs. A rapid, aggressive clicking sound echoed sharply against the polished marble floors of the hallway. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of extremely expensive, sharp stiletto heels marching furiously directly toward the executive office. I cannot believe the absolute sheer incompetence of that entire police department. A shrill, furious voice shrieked loudly, echoing through the narrow corridor. It was Ashley. Her voice was not weeping. It was not sorrowful. It was dripping with pure, toxic, aristocratic rage. I am paying thousands of dollars for public relations, and those idiot officers forced me to stand in the freezing, damp wind for 45 minutes, she yelled aggressively at her trailing assistant. Look at my hands. Look at them. I completely chipped my perfect French manicure on the side of that disgusting police cruiser door. My entire aesthetic is completely ruined for the evening news broadcast. Get my personal styling team on the phone right now and tell them to bring their equipment to my back office. I cannot let the cameras see me looking like a ragged, exhausted peasant. She had abandoned her highly publicized fake weeping performance at the police precinct and rushed straight back to her boutique, all over a single chipped fingernail. The sheer towering vanity of this horrific woman was about to get me completely caught. I spun around and stared in absolute terror at the glowing progress bar on the small monitor. 90%. Ashley's sharp, angry footsteps were closing the distance rapidly. She was walking straight down the private hallway, heading directly for the very door I was standing behind. 92%. Come on, I whispered fiercely under my breath, my hands shaking violently as I hovered my fingers directly over the heavy black cable. 95%. I could hear her assistant stammering nervously in the hallway, apologizing profusely and frantically dialing a phone. I do not want to hear your pathetic excuses. Ashley screamed, her voice now directly outside the frosted glass panel of the oak door. Just get them here now. I need to fix this disaster before Gregory's massive charity dinner tonight. 97%. The progress bar crawled forward with agonizing, impossible slowness. Ashley's shadow loomed large and dark against the frosted glass of the heavy office door. 98%. I heard the sharp metallic jingle of her heavy designer keys as she angrily dug through her luxury handbag. 99%. The heavy brass doorknob actually began to turn, slowly rotating downward as she violently forced her key into the lock. 100%. Extraction complete flashed brilliantly across the dark monitor. I did not waste a single microsecond. I violently yanked the heavy black cable directly out of the server port, securing the thick cloned hard drive tightly against my chest. I spun around and dove aggressively toward the heavy steel fire door, located at the absolute rear of the executive office, which led directly into the dark outer service alleyway. The front oak door swung completely open, hitting the wall with a loud, aggressive bang, just as I threw my entire body weight against the heavy steel push bar of the rear exit. I slipped seamlessly out into the freezing, damp alleyway. The heavy steel fire door, slamming firmly and automatically shut directly behind me. The loud, thick, metallic click of the heavy door locking into place echoed in the dark alley. I stood alone in the freezing gray mist, my chest heaving violently as I desperately gasped for air. I pressed my back hard against the cold, wet brick of the outer building, clutching the warm hard drive tightly in my trembling hands. I closed my eyes and let a cold, sharp, ruthless smile spread slowly across my face. I had done it. I possessed the absolute exact digital master keys to every single stolen offshore account they owned. The long, agonizing years of feeling small and defeated were officially entirely over. I now held the absolute terrifying power of life and death over their entire financial empire, and I was fully prepared to watch them absolutely drown. The heavy steel door of Harrison's remote woodland cabin locked firmly behind me with a solid, comforting thud. I stood in the rustic entryway, dripping cold rainwater from my tailored white coat onto the woven rug, but I did not feel the freezing chill. My blood was running incredibly hot, thick with the electric adrenaline of what I had just miraculously accomplished. I clutched the heavy cloned hard drive against my chest like it was a physical shield. It was the exact tangible manifestation of my absolute revenge. Harrison gently took my wet coat and guided me toward the warm kitchen, where a fresh pot of strong black coffee was already brewing on the stove. Upstairs, in the quiet guest loft, my sweet, beautiful Lily was still sleeping, safely hidden completely away from the arrogant monsters who had tortured her. I sat down heavily at the large oak kitchen table and placed the black hard drive right in the dead center of the wood. Harrison booted up his secure encrypted federal laptop and connected the thick black cable to the drive. The computer screen flickered instantly to life, casting a harsh pale blue glow across our exhausted faces. We did not speak a single meaningless word. There was absolutely no need for basic pleasantries or idle small talk. We were two highly focused soldiers preparing to drop a massive nuclear bomb on a corrupt, untouchable empire. The terrifying infiltration of Ashley's luxury boutique had given us the exact cryptographic master keys Gregory used to hide his stolen wealth. Now it was finally time to unlock the digital vault and see exactly how deep his rotting, sickening deception truly went. The silence in the warm cabin was broken only by the rapid rhythmic clicking of Harrison's keyboard and the soft crackling of the warm fire in the stone hearth. I wrapped my freezing hands tightly around my coffee mug, letting the intense heat seep deeply into my palms. My heart pounded a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. I was no longer the submissive, weeping pediatric nurse Gregory had manipulated and carelessly discarded. I was the cold, calculating architect of his absolute total destruction. Harrison ran the stolen master keys directly through his highly sophisticated federal decryption software. Lines of complex, glowing green code cascaded rapidly down the dark monitor, tearing violently through Gregory's expensive military-grade firewalls, like they were made of wet, fragile tissue paper. Gregory was a deeply arrogant and narcissistic man. He genuinely believed that his massive wealth and his fake pious public reputation made him entirely, completely untouchable. He always believed he was the smartest, most capable person in any room. But his towering arrogance had made him incredibly, fundamentally sloppy. As the primary encryption layers finally collapsed, the true staggering scale of his money laundering operation was laid completely bare before my eager eyes. We spent the next 3 grueling hours meticulously dissecting the massive digital ledger, spreading the data across multiple screens. Gregory had taken the millions of dollars from my late parents' trust fund and systematically funneled them through a dizzying, complex maze of domestic shell companies. He deliberately disguised the stolen inheritance as anonymous philanthropic donations, routing the illicit cash directly into the fake charity foundation Ashley publicly and proudly managed. From there, Bradley used his unquestioned powerful authority as head deacon at the church to officially sign off on massive fraudulent tax exemptions, completely washing the dirty money clean in the eyes of the government. But the money did not stay safely in the church building accounts. Once the funds were legally sanitized, Gregory used his master server to wire the clean, untraceable cash directly into 7 highly secure offshore accounts, located deep in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. I stared unblinking at the glowing white numbers on the dark screen. $14 million. $14 million of my family legacy stolen, manipulated, and hidden away simply to fund Ashley's excessive designer wardrobe and Gregory's lavish, powerful public image. A cold, dark fury settled permanently deep into my bones. They had used my daughter's precious future to build a completely fake kingdom of absolute lies. Harrison leaned back heavily in his wooden chair and rubbed his tired eyes. He told me we finally had the exact routing numbers and the perfect, undeniable digital trail to hand directly over to a federal prosecutor. He said we could easily prove the massive corporate fraud and send Gregory and Bradley to a federal penitentiary for the rest of their miserable natural lives. But I did not just want them to go to a sterile prison cell. Prison was far too clean and far too incredibly simple. I wanted them to experience the exact same terrifying, crushing powerlessness they had violently forced upon me. I wanted them to feel the absolute blinding terror of having their entire safe world completely ripped away in a single devastating second. I leaned closer to the bright monitor, instructing Harrison to pull up the original foundational incorporation documents for the primary legal shell company Gregory used to control the offshore accounts. This was the exact legal company Gregory had tricked me into signing away during my severe, agonizing postpartum depression 6 years ago, or so he arrogantly thought. I stared intently at the scanned digital PDF of the legal asset transfer agreement. Gregory had claimed my signature was on the document, legally removing me from the foundational trust and giving him sole, unadulterated power over the massive funds. But as I scrutinized the digital ink strokes, a cold, calculating smile slowly spread across my face. Harrison noticed my sudden dramatic shift in demeanor and asked exactly what I had found. I pointed my finger directly at the digital signature line on the glowing screen. I told him to magnify the specific image by 400%. As the jagged black pixels expanded massively on the monitor, the fatal structural error in Gregory's master plan became blaringly beautifully obvious. Gregory had forged my signature. He had sat alone in his dark office 6 years ago and roughly, lazily traced my name onto the legal transfer documents. But Gregory was a deeply narcissistic man who rarely paid attention to the fine minor details of the people he considered beneath him. When I legally sign my name on any binding professional document, I always use my full legal middle name. It is a strict, deeply ingrained habit from my long meticulous years of signing complex pediatric medical charts at the hospital. Gregory had only forged my first and last name. He had completely omitted my middle initial. Furthermore, he had completely failed to have the vital document properly stamped by a legally certified third-party notary. He had simply bribed a corrupt associate at his corporate real estate firm to push the fraudulent paperwork quietly through the local county clerk office. My mind raced with brilliant, terrifying legal clarity. Because the signature was a blatant, undeniable, crude forgery, and because the document lacked proper legal notarization, the initial transfer of power was entirely fundamentally void. In the eyes of the global banking system and international corporate law, I had never been legally removed from the foundational trust. I was not just an angry, bitter ex-wife looking for a petty divorce settlement. I was still the primary legal signatory on the original account that birthed every single subsequent shell company in Gregory's entire massive financial web. I still legally owned every single dollar of that $14 million offshore fortune. Gregory thought he had completely successfully buried me, but he had simply blindly handed me the absolute keys to his own brutal execution. Harrison stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. He slowly turned the heavy laptop toward me, pushing the keyboard gently across the smooth oak table. He simply told me the weapon was mine to fire. I sat up perfectly straight in my wooden chair, adjusting my posture until I radiated absolute unyielding authority. My hands were absolutely no longer shaking. The terrified, broken mother who used to apologize for existing was completely, entirely gone. I cracked my knuckles and placed my fingers gently on the cool plastic keys. Using the cryptographic master tokens I had stolen directly from Ashley's luxury boutique server, I logged into the primary Cayman Islands banking portal. The sleek system requested the master security authorization. I typed in the exact administrative override codes Harrison had successfully decrypted. A green loading circle spun briefly on the screen before the massive offshore vault swung completely wide open. 7 different international accounts populated the digital dashboard. The available balances were absolutely staggering. Millions of dollars sitting quietly in the dark, waiting to fund their next lavish tropical vacation or expensive imported sports car. I clicked on the very first account, transferring the entire massive balance into a secure locked blind trust managed entirely by Harrison's trusted federal legal contacts. I clicked submit. A small gray box appeared instantly confirming the massive transfer. The account balance immediately plummeted from $3 million to absolute zero. I quickly moved to the second account. I felt a tremendous, overwhelming rush of raw, visceral power course hotly through my veins with every single deliberate keystroke. For 6 long, agonizing years, Gregory had completely, aggressively controlled my life. He had dictated where I could live, what I could spend, and when I could safely see my own beautiful daughter. He had suffocated me with his stolen, powerful wealth. Now, with a few simple, silent clicks of a plastic keyboard, I was completely bleeding him entirely dry. I moved methodically and ruthlessly through the remaining offshore accounts. 3, 4, 5, 6. I drained every single penny, pulling the stolen money rapidly back into a legally untouchable federal holding account, where Gregory could never, ever reach it again. Finally, I reached the 7th and absolutely largest account. This was the primary operating fund Ashley strictly used to finance her massive fake charity events and maintain her wealthy elite aesthetic lifestyle. I stared hard at the glowing green numbers. $5.2 million. I hovered my finger over the mousepad and pressed the transfer button. The screen flashed bright green. The balance dropped instantly to 0.00. $14 million completely, entirely gone forever. I did not trigger a single security alert. I intentionally, cleverly bypassed the automated email notification system built into the banking portal. Gregory and Ashley would receive absolutely no warning messages. Their expensive phones would not buzz with urgent fraud alerts. The international banks would not call to inform them of the massive, catastrophic transfers. I effectively installed a massive, invisible, heavy guillotine directly over their arrogant heads and pulled the release lever in complete, absolute silence. They were completely financially dead, but they had absolutely no idea that their hearts had already completely stopped beating. I pushed the laptop back toward Harrison, leaning back comfortably in my chair and crossing my arms tightly over my chest. A deep, deeply satisfying warmth spread smoothly through my tired body. The silent strike was totally flawless. The lethal trap was fully permanently set. Harrison reached over and turned the volume up on the small television sitting on the kitchen counter. The morning news cycle was still aggressively completely dominated by Gregory's manufactured fake tragedy. A local entertainment reporter was broadcasting live from the grand luxurious ballroom of the city's most expensive hotel. Tonight was the highly anticipated annual Family Values Foundation charity auction. It was the exact massive high society gala Ashley had cruelly locked my daughter in a basement vault for. The excited reporter showed off the lavish, expensive floral arrangements, the towering crystal champagne pyramids, and the expensive silent auction items that wealthy elite donors would be bidding on all night long. She eagerly interviewed a local politician who praised Gregory and Ashley for their incredible resilience, noting how brave they were to continue hosting the charity event despite the tragic kidnapping of their beloved, beautiful daughter Lily. I watched the bright television screen with a cold, lethal smile playing softly on my lips. Gregory and Ashley were currently preparing to host the absolute biggest, most incredibly expensive night of their entire lives. They were planning to stand proudly on a brightly lit stage in front of hundreds of wealthy, powerful people, completely bathing in the fake adoration and sympathetic applause of their elite peers. They were going to swipe their heavy, glossy black corporate credit cards to pay the massive exclusive caterers, the expensive event planners, and the luxury hotel management team. They were fully comfortably expecting the offshore accounts to cover the hundreds of thousands of dollars required to maintain their fake royal image tonight. The poetic, brutal justice of the situation was almost intoxicatingly sweet. They were currently putting on their expensive designer clothes, fixing their flawless hair, and preparing to play the role of the tragic, wealthy royalty. They had absolutely no clue that the financial ground beneath their feet had already completely vanished. They were standing heavily on pure thin air. When those expensive corporate cards were swiped at the end of the night, they would violently, decisively decline. When Gregory frantically opened his secure banking app in a blind, terrifying panic, trying to move emergency funds, he would find nothing but absolute zeros, staring back at his arrogant, stunned face. The massive charity checks would violently immediately bounce. The wealthy donors would instantly realize the foundation was completely entirely bankrupt. The absolute ultimate public humiliation they had planned for me was about to crash directly down onto their own heads in the middle of a crowded, elegant ballroom. I stood up from the heavy oak table, feeling incredibly tall, incredibly powerful, and absolutely untouchable. I walked slowly over to the cabin window, looking out at the calm, quiet pine trees surrounding the remote property. The violent, freezing storm from the previous night had completely passed, leaving behind a crisp, beautifully clear morning. I had successfully completely crossed the burning bridge and entirely destroyed the path behind me. There was absolutely no going back to the weak, terrified woman I used to be. The invisible guillotine was currently falling rapidly through the air, and I was fully comfortably prepared to watch it finally completely sever the head of Gregory's rotting fake empire. I turned back to Harrison and asked him to kindly pour me another cup of hot black coffee. We had a very long, highly entertaining evening ahead of us. The bright morning sun slowly began to filter through the tall, dense pine trees surrounding Harrison's remote woodland cabin, casting long, pale shadows across the rustic wooden floor. I sat perfectly still at the heavy oak kitchen table, holding a fresh mug of steaming black coffee between my hands. The intense, chaotic adrenaline of the previous night had completely burned away, leaving behind a state of pure, absolute, crystal-clear focus. The cloned hard drive I had successfully ripped from Ashley's luxury boutique was currently plugged directly into Harrison's secure federal laptop. We had already executed the silent legal strike, completely freezing the $14 million in Gregory's offshore accounts and leaving their entire financial empire at absolute zero. But the massive digital server contained so much more than just the raw financial ledgers and the offshore routing numbers. It was the absolute central nervous system for their entire fake luxurious lives. Harrison tapped his fingers rhythmically against the edge of the table, his sharp analytical eyes scanning the endless lines of green code scrolling rapidly down the dark monitor. He had discovered a hidden secondary partition within the cloned drive. Gregory had integrated the secure server to handle the internal communications network for both his corporate real estate firm and Ashley's luxury lifestyle boutique. This included the private voice over internet protocol phone systems and the internal digital voicemails. We were now sitting in the absolute safety of the isolated cabin with full unrestricted access to their private communication network. Harrison typed a rapid sequence of complex commands into the terminal, bypassing the basic administrative firewalls. He isolated the direct audio feeds linking Gregory's downtown private office to Ashley's boutique and routed the sound directly through the small, encrypted speakers sitting on the kitchen counter. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the wooden table, my heart beating with a cold, heavy anticipation. I was about to hear the exact moment their perfectly curated, invincible world completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. The first audio file we intercepted was a frantic, desperate voicemail left on Gregory's private office line by his senior event coordinator. The poor woman sounded like she was on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. She pleaded with Gregory to call her back immediately, stating that the primary corporate credit card, tied directly to the Family Values Foundation, had violently declined. She said the massive luxury hotel hosting the evening charity gala was threatening to completely pull the plug on the entire event. The expensive gourmet caterers were refusing to unload the food trucks, and the exclusive floral designers were actively repossessing the towering crystal champagne pyramids because the initial deposit checks had just violently bounced. The coordinator begged Gregory to wire the emergency funds, immediately explaining that the wealthy elite donors were expecting a flawless, extravagant evening, and the hotel management was growing increasingly hostile. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot black coffee. The invisible guillotine had finally dropped, and the sharp blade was cutting directly through their thick, arrogant vanity. Harrison clicked on a new live audio file. It was a direct, active connection from Gregory's private office speakerphone. The heavy oak door of Gregory's office burst open with a loud, violent crash, echoing sharply through the small cabin speakers. The aggressive, rapid clicking of expensive stiletto heels slammed furiously against the hardwood floor. It was Ashley. Her voice was an absolute shrill, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated, toxic rage. She demanded to know exactly why her premium platinum credit cards were currently declining all over the city. She screamed that she had just endured the ultimate humiliation of having her card rejected at her exclusive luxury spa, while her wealthy friends were watching her. She yelled that the charity gala was just hours away, and the hotel manager had practically laughed in her face when she tried to process the remaining balance for the extravagant ballroom decorations. Gregory's voice came through the audio feed completely stripped of its usual smooth, arrogant baritone. He sounded entirely panicked, his words stumbling heavily over each other as he tried to desperately calm his furious wife. He told her to lower her voice and close the heavy office door. He said there was a massive, catastrophic error with the offshore Cayman accounts. He explained, his voice cracking with absolute raw terror, that he had logged into the primary banking portal just 10 minutes ago and found every single international account completely drained to absolute zero. He said the $14 million was entirely gone without a single warning notification or security alert. He told Ashley that the entire financial foundation of their luxury lifestyle was completely missing, and the corporate bank was refusing to answer his urgent international calls. Ashley did not care about the offshore banking errors or the missing corporate funds. Her true vile colors bled completely through the speakers, dropping the fake weeping mother persona entirely. She violently slammed her hands down onto his wooden desk, screaming that her entire public reputation was currently on the line. She said she had spent all morning standing in the freezing, damp wind outside the police precinct, pretending to cry for the local news cameras to make him look like a sympathetic victim. She explicitly stated that she did not care about Lily at all. She called my beautiful, terrified daughter a miserable, ungrateful little brat who was completely ruining her perfect aesthetic life. She yelled that she only agreed to play the role of the devoted stepmother because Gregory had promised her endless unlimited wealth and exclusive high society status. Now she was staring at the terrifying prospect of a cancelled charity gala and a violently bounced corporate credit card. She demanded that Gregory fix the situation immediately, or she would pack her expensive designer bags and leave him to drown in his own miserable failure. I sat in the warm cabin listening to her vicious, cruel words without feeling a single ounce of pain. Hearing her verbally abuse my daughter no longer made me feel helpless or small. It only solidified the cold, hard reality that I was doing the absolute right thing. They were incredibly vile, selfish monsters, and they fully deserved the catastrophic ruin currently raining down upon their heads. Harrison looked at me across the table, a grim, satisfied expression settling deeply into the lines of his weathered face. He reached out and adjusted the volume on the small speakers as the sound of a third person abruptly entered the chaotic argument. The heavy office door opened again, and Bradley stepped into the room. His breathing sounded incredibly heavy and labored, a distinct raspy wheeze echoing through the audio feed. My precise, brutal strike to his brachial plexus the night before had clearly done severe, lasting damage. His voice was weak and strained, but dripping with an intense, venomous fury. He completely ignored Ashley's shrill screaming and addressed his brother directly. Bradley demanded the immediate transfer of the laundered church funds. He said the private construction contractors working on the massive new Grace Fellowship building addition were aggressively demanding their final payments. He explained that he had authorized the fraudulent charitable tax exemptions exactly as Gregory had instructed, but now the church building accounts were completely overdrawn and the contractors were threatening to go directly to the local press. Gregory practically sobbed into the speakerphone, telling his older brother that the offshore money was completely gone. He said the master server inside the boutique had been completely breached and the cryptographic tokens were entirely missing. He blamed Bradley for failing to stop me in the basement wine cellar, calling him a weak, pathetic old man for letting a simple pediatric nurse knock him unconscious and escape into the storm. Bradley violently retaliated, his strained voice rising in a dark, menacing threat. He told Gregory that the church was his entire life, and he would not allow a massive federal money laundering scandal to completely destroy his pristine, holy reputation. He said if Gregory did not magically produce the missing millions by the end of the day, he would go directly to the federal authorities himself. Bradley threatened to sit down in front of a federal judge and swear under a sacred oath that Gregory had completely masterminded the entire criminal operation using his innocent religious charity as a forced, unwilling shield. The fragile, arrogant alliance between the three monsters instantly completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. Ashley continued to shriek violently in the background, threatening to call her expensive divorce attorneys and publicly expose Gregory's fake victim narrative to the eager news media. She screamed that she would tell the world exactly how he had forged the asset transfer documents to steal my inheritance if it meant saving her own precious skin. Gregory roared back at her with absolute blinding fury, telling her she was equally complicit in the massive fraud and would happily go down with the sinking ship. He turned his terrifying rage back onto his older brother, threatening to hand over the actual physical church ledgers to the federal prosecutors. He told Bradley he had kept meticulous hidden records of every single dirty dollar that flowed through the church building fund, and he would happily throw the great pious head deacon entirely under the bus to save himself from a maximum security prison sentence. They were completely, viciously tearing each other apart. The pressure of the invisible guillotine had instantly cracked their fake, perfect facades, completely exposing the desperate, terrified, cornered rats hiding underneath. For 6 years, they had operated as a unified, flawless team, completely dedicated to making my life an absolute living hell. They had meticulously orchestrated my mental destruction, successfully stolen my family legacy, and cruelly manipulated the legal system to isolate my only child. They had presented themselves to the entire world as the ultimate portrait of wealth, religious devotion, and moral superiority. But the very second their stolen money completely vanished, their loyalty to each other violently evaporated into thin air. I leaned back in the sturdy wooden chair and closed my eyes, letting the beautiful, chaotic sound of their absolute destruction wash completely over me. I listened to Ashley sobbing hysterically about her ruined dresses and her cancelled expensive gala. I listened to Bradley wheezing in physical pain, desperately threatening his own flesh and blood to save his corrupt holy image. I listened to Gregory, the brilliant, arrogant wealth manager who thought he was entirely untouchable, completely losing his mind as his vast criminal empire violently collapsed around him. It was the most exquisite, perfect symphony of pure, unadulterated justice I had ever heard in my entire life. Harrison silently reached out and muted the speaker system, letting the warm, quiet peace of the woodland cabin return. He looked across the oak table and gave me a single slow nod of profound respect. He told me the internal conflict was the final perfect piece of the puzzle. The fact that they were actively threatening to expose each other meant the federal prosecutors would have an incredibly easy job securing full written confessions. He said we had successfully completely dismantled their operation and gathered enough irrefutable forensic evidence to lock them away for decades. I opened my eyes and looked down at my hands. They were perfectly, entirely steady. I looked over at the black and white surveillance monitor where my daughter Lily was still sleeping safely in the warm guest room. We had survived the brutal, endless nightmare, and we had successfully completely turned the tables on the monsters who tried to bury us. The cornered rats were currently trapped inside their own burning house, desperately chewing through each other's throats to escape the massive inferno. But I was not entirely finished. They had taken 6 long, agonizing years of my life, and they had stolen my daughter's innocence for their own selfish vanity. I stood up from the wooden table, smoothing down the crisp fabric of my white tailored coat. I looked at Harrison with a cold, fearless smile, radiating absolute, undeniable power. I told him it was time to make one final phone call. It was time to invite the federal authorities to the charity gala and deliver the final fatal blow, exactly when Gregory and Ashley were standing under the brightest lights. The heavy steel door of Harrison's remote woodland bunker closed firmly behind me for the final time. I walked up the wooden stairs and out into the crisp, cool evening air, feeling completely, entirely reborn. I was absolutely no longer the exhausted, terrified pediatric nurse who had driven frantically through the violent, freezing rain just 24 hours ago. I was a completely different entity. I was a lethal, highly calculating force of absolute destruction. Harrison had utilized his extensive federal contacts to secure me a flawless high-end disguise. I wore a stunning, perfectly tailored emerald green silk suit. The rich, dark fabric clung smoothly to my frame, radiating an aura of cold, unassailable power. The sharp, angled platinum blonde bob brushed cleanly against my jawline, completely hiding the submissive brown-haired mother Gregory had spent 6 years trying to violently erase. I paired the emerald suit with a pair of sleek black leather stilettos that clicked with heavy, aggressive authority against the paved driveway. Harrison stood quietly by his dark hunting truck and handed me a small, sleek black clutch purse. Inside the bag rested the exact physical copies of the forged offshore banking transfers and the undeniable digital proof that their entire financial empire was completely bankrupt. I looked at Harrison and gave him a single firm nod of profound gratitude. He promised to stay right there at the remote woodland cabin guarding my beautiful sleeping daughter Lily with his heavy black shotgun and his absolute federal authority. I slid behind the steering wheel of his secure, untraceable vehicle and drove slowly away from the isolated pine trees, heading straight back into the glowing, predatory heart of the city. The drive back to the affluent, wealthy suburbs felt incredibly short. My mind was perfectly, entirely clear. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or hesitation as I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the elite, prestigious Oak Brook Country Club. This was the exact opulent location Gregory had chosen to host the highly publicized Crystal Gala. It was the absolute crowning jewel of their fake charitable foundation. Tonight, Gregory was proudly scheduled to receive the highly coveted Philanthropist of the Year award. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of a man who literally stole $14 million from his ex-wife and locked his own child in a dark concrete closet, receiving a humanitarian award, made my blood run incredibly cold. I handed the keys of the dark SUV to a highly confused valet attendant and stepped onto the long plush red carpet leading up to the sprawling country club entrance. The outdoor courtyard was completely overflowing with expensive luxury vehicles, flashing press cameras, and incredibly wealthy local elite politicians. I walked right past the heavy velvet security ropes, ignoring the flashing strobe lights of the local news media, completely entirely focused on the massive, heavy mahogany double doors at the top of the grand marble staircase. My black stilettos struck the smooth, polished marble with sharp, rhythmic echoes that completely pierced the cool evening air. I reached the top of the towering marble staircase and stood directly in front of the grand entrance to the main ballroom. I could hear the loud, sweeping notes of a live professional orchestra playing an elegant classical symphony inside. I could hear the muffled, chaotic sounds of hundreds of wealthy donors, laughing loudly and clinking expensive crystal champagne flutes. They were completely blissfully unaware that the lavish, extravagant party they were currently enjoying was entirely funded by dirty, stolen money that no longer even existed. I placed my hands flat against the heavy brass handles of the massive mahogany doors. I took one final deep, steadying breath, letting the crisp, cool air fill my burning lungs. I pushed the heavy doors completely open with a violent, aggressive shove. The heavy wood swung inward, hitting the interior walls with a loud, deafening crash that ripped violently through the elegant music. The massive, sprawling ballroom was absolutely breathtakingly decadent. Towering crystal chandeliers hung gracefully from the high-vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, sparkling golden light over the hundreds of guests. Massive, elaborate, floral centerpieces featuring thousands of imported white roses decorated every single round dining table. At the far end of the sprawling room sat an enormous, perfectly carved ice sculpture shaped like a soaring dove. The sheer massive cost of the evening was visibly, explicitly staggering. As the heavy mahogany doors crashed loudly against the walls, the entire massive ballroom reacted with immediate physical shock. The live professional orchestra sitting on the elevated side stage abruptly stopped playing their classical instruments in a chaotic, discordant screech of violin strings and cello bows. The loud, booming laughter of the wealthy elite donors completely died in their throats. Hundreds of expensive crystal champagne glasses halted entirely mid-air. The transition from a loud, chaotic celebration to absolute, complete dead silence happened in a fraction of a second. The sudden, heavy quiet in the massive room was incredibly thick and entirely suffocating. Every single eye in the sprawling, elegant ballroom turned completely toward the grand entrance. They expected to see a clumsy, late-arriving guest, or perhaps a confused catering waiter dropping a silver tray. Instead, they saw me. I stood perfectly still, framed beautifully by the towering mahogany doorway, radiating cold, absolute, venomous power. The tailored emerald green silk suit caught the bright, brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers, making me look like a dangerous, predatory jewel. My icy platinum blonde hair framed a face completely devoid of any human emotion. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply looked out over the sea of wealthy, corrupt individuals with an expression of pure, lethal calculation. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold and walking directly into the massive, silent room. The sharp, aggressive clicking of my black leather stilettos echoed violently against the polished hardwood floor. Click, click, click. The sound was incredibly loud, slicing cleanly through the thick, heavy silence like a sharp, rhythmic metronome, ticking down the final seconds of their fake, flawless lives. The sea of wealthy, elite guests instinctively, physically parted before me. Women wearing custom, expensive designer gowns and men wearing perfectly tailored black tuxedos quickly shuffled backward, bumping blindly into their elegant dining tables simply to get out of my direct path. They stared at me with wide, terrified, confused eyes, completely failing to recognize the broken, submissive, exhausted pediatric nurse Gregory had publicly mocked for 6 long years. I looked absolutely incredibly foreign to them. I looked like a wealthy, powerful executive marching directly toward a hostile corporate takeover. I walked slowly and deliberately down the long center aisle of the ballroom, keeping my posture rigidly straight and my shoulders pulled firmly back. My eyes scanned the massive room, completely ignoring the whispering, confused faces of the wealthy local politicians and the corrupt, silent auction donors. I was looking for the absolute center of the disease. I found them sitting proudly at the primary VIP table located directly in front of the main illuminated stage. Gregory and Ashley. They were completely, entirely frozen in their velvet dining chairs. Gregory was wearing an immaculate custom black tuxedo, his hair perfectly styled, and his posture previously relaxed and arrogant. Ashley sat directly beside him, wearing a massive, sprawling, bright red designer gown, dripping in expensive, heavy diamond jewelry that she had purchased entirely with my stolen generational wealth. Gregory's smug, arrogant face completely drained of all human color the exact second his dark eyes locked onto my emerald suit. His heavy square jaw actually dropped open slightly completely, ruining his flawlessly curated, wealthy philanthropist persona. He stared at me in absolute blinding horror, fully expecting me to be currently hiding in a dirty, dark ditch, completely terrified of the massive nationwide Amber Alert he had maliciously launched that morning. He fully thought I was a broken, desperate fugitive running blindly from the local police. Seeing me walk effortlessly and powerfully into his incredibly exclusive charity gala completely short-circuited his arrogant, narcissistic brain. He slowly stood up from his velvet chair, his hands actually visibly trembling as he gripped the edge of the circular table for physical support. Ashley reacted completely differently. Her initial shock violently morphed into pure, toxic, aristocratic fury. She had spent the entire morning standing in the freezing, damp wind outside Momo, the downtown police precinct, staging a fake weeping performance for the eager local news cameras. She had completely ruined her perfect French manicure, trying to sell the narrative that she was a heartbroken, terrified stepmother. Now her carefully constructed, flawless aesthetic was being completely threatened by my sudden, powerful appearance. Her face flushed a deep, angry crimson, completely clashing with her bright red designer gown. She looked around the silent ballroom, seeing all of her wealthy elite friends staring directly at us. She instantly realized that she was losing absolute control of the narrative, and she desperately, frantically scrambled to regain her public power. Ashley shoved her velvet chair backward violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She practically leaped to her feet, completely ignoring Gregory's panicked, trembling silence. She reached frantically into her expensive diamond-encrusted clutch purse and whipped out her sleek gold smartphone. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers rapidly, frantically tap the glowing screen. She was not dialing the local police department or calling the private venue security team. She was launching a live public broadcast directly to her millions of gullible, adoring social media followers. She desperately needed an audience to witness her fake, righteous anger. She needed to publicly destroy me before I could ever utter a single word about the completely empty offshore bank accounts. "Look, everyone!" Ashley screamed loudly, her shrill, piercing voice completely shattering the heavy silence of the sprawling ballroom. She held her gold smartphone high in the air, pointing the glowing camera lens directly at my face. "Look exactly who decided to show up to our beautiful charity gala. It is the crazy, deranged kidnapper. She violently assaulted our beloved church deacon and maliciously stole my precious, beautiful stepdaughter right out of our home. Security. Security, get in here right now and completely arrest this violent, psychotic woman." Ashley marched aggressively around the VIP table, completely closing the short physical distance between us. She shoved the glowing camera lens directly into my personal space, holding the phone just mere inches away from my face. Her toxic, heavy perfume washed over me, smelling strongly of synthetic roses and pure desperation. She glared at me with absolute blinding hatred, fully completely expecting me to dramatically cower. She expected me to cover my face frantically, turn around, and run terrified out of the massive mahogany doors. She wanted me to cry and beg, and look exactly like the crazy, unstable fugitive Gregory had promised the entire world I was. She wanted the perfect viral internet video of my complete total public breakdown. But I did not cower. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to block her glowing camera lens. I stood perfectly, incredibly still, holding my sleek black clutch purse loosely at my side. I looked directly into the dark digital lens of her smartphone and then shifted my gaze slowly to look straight into her furious, panicked eyes. I let a cold, sharp, calculating smile spread effortlessly across my face. I radiated an aura of pure, absolute, unassailable boss energy, completely dwarfing her loud, shrill, desperate performance. I allowed the heavy silence of the massive ballroom to stretch out, making her erratic screaming look completely, entirely unhinged to the hundreds of wealthy donors watching us. Ashley's shrill voice began to waver slightly as she realized I was not reacting to her aggressive public shaming. She pushed the gold phone closer to my face, her hands beginning to tremble with pure toxic frustration. "Why are you just standing there smiling, you completely psychotic woman?" she shrieked loudly, her fake poised aesthetic completely unraveling at the seams. "You are going to a federal prison for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. The entire country is currently looking for you, and you just walked straight into a room full of highly influential, powerful people. You are completely, entirely finished, Evelyn." I kept my cold, calculated smile perfectly in place, absolutely refusing to break my intense, unyielding eye contact. The wealthy elite guests were beginning to murmur, softly exchanging confused, terrified glances. They were watching a supposedly heartbroken, terrified stepmother frantically, aggressively screaming into a cell phone while the supposed deranged, violent kidnapper stood with perfect, flawless elegance, completely unbothered by the threat of arrest. Gregory finally stumbled out from behind the VIP table, his face absolutely ashen, wiping nervous sweat from his brow. He reached out to grab Ashley's arm, trying desperately to pull her and her broadcasting smartphone back, but she violently yanked her shoulder away, completely blinded by her own desperate vanity. "I am not leaving this spot until you are dragged out of here, in heavy steel handcuffs," Ashley yelled aggressively, her chest heaving violently under her red designer gown. "You think you can just come in here wearing expensive clothes and ruin my perfect, beautiful night? You are nothing but a pathetic, weak little nurse who completely failed her own family. Security. Where is the absolute incompetent security team in this building? Arrest her right now before she tries to violently attack someone else." I took one single deliberate step forward, completely closing the physical gap between us. My sudden, smooth movement made Ashley instinctively, physically flinch backward, her stiletto heel catching slightly on the edge of the hardwood floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or match her chaotic, erratic energy. I simply leaned slightly forward, letting my cold, icy presence completely surround her frantic, shaking body. I was fully, entirely prepared to completely dismantle their glamorous, fraudulent life right in front of her eager, glowing audience. I stood tall, radiating a powerful, absolute calm that completely paralyzed the entire room. Ashley's desperate screaming echoed uselessly against the high-vaulted ceilings of the country club, completely failing to provoke the reaction she so deeply craved. The private venue security guards, dressed in dark, tailored suits, had finally pushed their way through the massive crowd of stunned, wealthy donors. But they hesitated completely, unsure of how to proceed. They saw a screaming, frantic woman in a red gown shoving a phone, and they saw a perfectly composed, elegantly dressed executive who looked like she owned the entire building. The stark, dramatic contrast completely short-circuited their protocol. They stood awkwardly near the edge of the dance floor, waiting for a clear, firm directive from Gregory, who was currently completely physically incapable of speaking a single coherent word. Gregory stood frozen near the massive ice sculpture, his dark eyes darting frantically between my confident, calm face and the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room. He was a man who survived entirely on manipulating the fine hidden details of corporate law and hiding behind thick layers of protective legal bureaucracy. Now the absolute physical embodiment of his greatest massive failure was standing directly in front of his wealthy, powerful peers, completely, entirely unafraid. He could physically sense that the heavy, invisible guillotine I had quietly placed over his neck was currently trembling on the absolute brink of falling. He slowly raised a shaking hand to his mouth, his pristine black tuxedo suddenly looking like an incredibly heavy, suffocating costume. Ashley continued to hold the gold phone tightly in front of my face, broadcasting her own desperate unraveling directly to the entire world. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her public live stream was actually playing perfectly, entirely into my hands. She was doing the exact heavy lifting for me, providing me with a massive captive audience of millions to witness the absolute total destruction of their fake criminal empire. I did not want to simply whisper the truth in a quiet, hidden courtroom. I wanted every single person who had ever liked her fake charitable posts or donated to her fraudulent foundation to see the exact moment her entire luxurious aesthetic violently crashed into absolute nothingness. The live professional orchestra remained completely silent on the elevated stage, holding their expensive instruments awkwardly in their laps. The elegant waiters stood perfectly frozen, holding heavy silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and vintage champagne. The entire opulent crystal gala had been effectively completely hijacked by my silent, powerful presence. I looked down at the glowing screen of Ashley's gold phone, watching the digital comments scrolling frantically upward as her millions of followers watched the intense, silent standoff. They were all waiting for me to break down, to cry, to beg, or to violently attack her. They were all completely hungry for the tragic, violent drama Gregory had promised them on the morning news broadcast. I slowly raised my left hand completely, ignoring Ashley's trembling phone, and elegantly brushed a stray piece of icy platinum blonde hair perfectly behind my ear. The simple, graceful movement was entirely deliberate, radiating an aura of total, unbothered control. I looked back at Ashley, whose bright red face was now covered in a thin sheen of frantic, panicked sweat. She was breathing heavily, completely exhausting herself with her own toxic, shrill energy. She realized that her loud, aggressive words were bouncing harmlessly off my tailored emerald suit, leaving absolutely no mark whatsoever. I tightened my grip slightly on the sleek black clutch purse in my right hand, feeling the thick, solid edge of the printed offshore bank statements pressing through the expensive leather. I possessed the absolute exact forensic proof of their massive federal tax evasion and corporate money laundering. I knew with absolute flawless certainty that their massive corporate credit cards were currently declining all over the city, and that their highly secure Cayman Islands accounts were currently sitting at absolute perfect zero. They were entirely, completely bankrupt, and they had absolutely no idea. I stood in the middle of their incredibly expensive, perfectly curated fake charity gala, and I smiled. The intense, glorious confrontation was perfectly, beautifully staged, and I was fully, comfortably prepared to deliver the absolute fatal blow that would completely end their arrogant reign forever. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stood perfectly still under the blinding glare of the massive crystal chandeliers while Ashley shoved her gold smartphone directly into my face. The bright digital light from her screen illuminated the pure toxic hatred twisting her heavily manicured features. She continued to scream to her millions of live viewers that I was a dangerous, violent kidnapper who had come to ruin her perfect charity gala. She wanted me to cower. She wanted me to raise my hands to cover my face and run away in absolute terror. But I simply let a cold, calculating smile form on my lips. The terrified, submissive woman she thought she knew was completely gone. I was an entirely different force now, and I was holding the absolute power of life and death over their entire fake empire. I calmly raised my left hand and gently, physically pushed her phone aside with one single fluid motion. Ashley gasped in absolute shock, her eyes widening as she stumbled backward in her heavy red designer gown. She was completely, utterly stunned that I was not reacting to her vicious public shaming. I did not waste a single word on her. I completely ignored her frantic shrieking and walked right past her, my emerald green silk suit radiating an aura of total, unassailable power. The crowd of wealthy elite donors parted before me like a massive wave, dividing perfectly to let me pass. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer overwhelming confidence I exuded. I walked deliberately up the small set of carpeted steps leading directly onto the main elevated stage where the polished wooden podium stood waiting for Gregory. The entire grand ballroom was dead silent, except for the sharp, aggressive clicking of my black leather stilettos hitting the wooden stage floor. Gregory stood frozen near the massive ice sculpture, completely incapable of moving a single muscle. His face was the color of dirty ash. He knew exactly what was happening, but his arrogant brain completely refused to accept the reality of his massive impending destruction. I stepped directly up to the main microphone. I wrapped my hands firmly around the sides of the wooden podium. I looked out over the sea of hundreds of wealthy, powerful guests. I could see the confusion and the terrified anticipation painted clearly on every single face in the room. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing loudly and perfectly clearly through the expensive venue sound system. The smooth, calm tone of my own voice surprised even me. I know you are all gathered here tonight to celebrate Gregory and to award him the incredibly prestigious title of Philanthropist of the Year. I know you have all opened your checkbooks and swiped your corporate credit cards to donate massive sums of money to the beautiful Family Values Foundation. But before the evening continues, I believe it is entirely necessary to show you exactly where your generous charitable donations have actually been going. I looked toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the massive ballroom. I gave a single sharp nod. Harrison stepped through the doorway. The retired federal agent was not wearing a tuxedo. He wore his heavy dark tactical jacket and carried a sleek silver tablet in his right hand. He walked into the elegant room with the heavy, deliberate stride of a man entirely comfortable with bringing absolute ruin to corrupt criminals. The private security guard standing near the walls took one look at his cold, authoritative demeanor and completely backed away, instinctively recognizing a superior predatory force. Harrison walked straight over to the primary audiovisual control desk, located at the side of the grand room. The young frightened technician sitting at the soundboard scrambled out of his chair in total, absolute panic. Harrison simply plugged a thick black cable directly from his secure federal tablet into the main projection system of the country club. I looked back down at Gregory. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He finally found his voice, taking a frantic, stumbling step toward the stage. "Turn that off!" he roared, his voice cracking violently with desperation. "Security! Grab that man right now! Turn off the screens!" But absolutely no one moved. The security guards remained completely firmly planted against the wall. The wealthy guests held their collective breath, entirely captivated by the massive drama unfolding directly in front of them. Harrison tapped the glowing screen of his tablet. Instantly, the three massive white projection screens, suspended high above the elegant stage, flickered brilliantly to life. They did not display the touching, carefully curated tribute video Ashley had meticulously planned to show her wealthy friends. Instead, the massive glowing screens filled completely with the stark, undeniable forensic evidence we had ripped directly from their hidden boutique server just a few hours ago. The very first image displayed was a massive, highly detailed financial spreadsheet mapping out the exact flow of the stolen money. I pointed up at the bright screens, my voice ringing with total, lethal authority. "You're currently looking at the actual private bank records of the Family Values Foundation," I announced clearly to the silent room. "You will notice that the millions of dollars you so generously donated did not go to local community orphanages or struggling families. Instead, they were aggressively funneled through a series of fake domestic shell companies entirely authorized by the head deacon of Grace Fellowship. Every single dollar was then wired directly into 7 completely private offshore accounts located deep in the Cayman Islands. Accounts owned entirely and exclusively by Gregory and Ashley to fund their lavish designer lifestyles." Loud, chaotic gasps erupted across the sprawling ballroom. The wealthy donors began pointing at the massive screens, completely horrified, as they saw their own personal charitable donations listed directly next to fraudulent international wire transfers. Gregory grabbed his hair with both hands, his pristine black tuxedo jacket sliding awkwardly off his shoulder as he stared at the absolute total collapse of his financial empire displayed for the entire world to see. But I was not entirely finished. I looked directly at Ashley, who was still standing near the VIP table holding her gold smartphone. The live stream to her millions of followers was still completely actively broadcasting every single second of the devastating confrontation. Harrison tapped his tablet a second time. The financial documents on the massive screens were abruptly replaced by a stark black audio waveform graphic. The venue sound system crackled sharply. Suddenly, Ashley's shrill, arrogant voice boomed loudly through the massive ballroom speakers, echoing violently off the high-vaulted ceilings. It was the exact frantic audio recording Harrison and I had intercepted from the internal boutique server just a few short hours ago. "I do not care about that miserable, ungrateful little brat," Ashley's recorded voice shrieked loudly for the hundreds of wealthy guests to hear. "She completely ruined my perfect aesthetic. I locked her in that freezing concrete basement closet because she was ruining my brand. I only agreed to play the role of the devoted stepmother because you promised me endless, unlimited wealth, Gregory. Now my premium credit cards are declining all over the city. You need to fix this right now, or I'm leaving you to drown." The absolute sheer devastating impact of her own cruel, toxic words playing over the loud venue speakers was entirely magnificent. The entire room erupted into total chaotic uproar. The elite guests began shouting in absolute disgust, realizing they had been completely played by a pair of ruthless, vile monsters who abused a child for internet vanity. Ashley stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, completely surrounded by the horrified, disgusted faces of the very elite peers she so desperately wanted to impress. The heavy realization of what was currently happening slammed violently into her brain. She looked down at the gold smartphone trembling in her manicured hand. The digital comments on her live stream were flying upward at lightning speed. Millions of people across the entire country were currently watching her own recorded confession playing directly behind her on her. They were actively hearing her admit to child abuse and massive federal money laundering. Her perfectly curated, fake, innocent aesthetic was entirely permanently eradicated in a matter of seconds. Ashley let out a loud, pathetic, sobbing wail. Her hands shook so violently that the expensive gold smartphone simply slipped right through her fingers. The device hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp crack, the screen shattering completely. She dropped heavily to her knees, her massive red designer gown pulling around her on the floor. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly and pathetically as the absolute finality of her public destruction crushed her completely. She had wanted to publicly shame me, but she had simply provided the exact massive captive audience required for her own brutal execution. Gregory realized in that exact same terrifying second that his entire perfectly controlled life was permanently, absolutely over. The money was completely gone. His reputation was entirely destroyed. His brother was completely implicated in a massive federal tax evasion scheme. He looked up at me, standing powerfully behind the wooden podium in my tailored emerald suit, and a completely blinding, violent rage completely overtook his rational mind. He completely snapped. The polished, wealthy philanthropist entirely vanished, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered, violent rat. "I will kill you, Gregory!" roared his voice, a guttural, terrifying scream that ripped through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. He lunged violently toward the elevated stage, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly on the polished floor. He reached his large hands out, trying aggressively to grab the edge of the stage and pull himself up to reach me. He wanted to wrap his hands entirely around my throat and destroy the woman who had just completely systematically dismantled his entire universe. I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly comfortably behind the wooden podium, looking down at him with a cold, detached pity. Before Gregory could even manage to pull his body onto the elevated stage, a massive dark blur of motion intercepted him completely. Harrison moved with terrifying, absolute lethal speed. He dropped his silver tablet, crossed the short physical distance, and tackled Gregory violently from the side. Harrison drove his heavy shoulder directly into Gregory's ribs, sending the arrogant wealth manager crashing wildly across the hardwood floor. They hit the base of the massive ice sculpture, completely shattering a large, beautiful crystal vase of white roses in the process. Gregory frantically tried to fight back, throwing wild, desperate punches, but he was absolutely, completely outmatched. Harrison was a seasoned, highly trained federal agent who had spent decades dealing with violent, desperate criminals. Harrison smoothly grabbed Gregory's right arm, twisting it painfully behind his back, and violently shoved his face directly down onto the cold, wet floor, perfectly pinning him in place. Gregory groaned loudly in physical agony, completely, entirely immobilized under Harrison's heavy, relentless knee. "Stay exactly right there, you pathetic, miserable thief!" Harrison growled loudly, his deep, gravelly voice echoing with absolute, unquestioned authority. At that exact, incredibly beautiful moment, the massive, heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom flew violently open for a second time. The loud, chaotic murmuring of the wealthy elite crowd turned into absolute, pure, panicked shrieking as a massive swarm of heavily armed federal agents completely flooded into the elegant room. They wore dark tactical jackets with bright, bold yellow letters displaying the initials of the Federal Bureau. Harrison had called them directly from the secure woodland cabin, utilizing his old, incredibly loyal task force contacts to completely bypass the corrupt local police department. The federal agents moved with absolute flawless precision, spreading out rapidly across the massive sprawling ballroom. They completely surrounded the VIP tables, securing the physical perimeter and firmly blocking all possible exits. Two large tactical agents marched directly over to where Ashley was still sobbing pathetically on the hardwood floor near her shattered cell phone. They completely ignored her dramatic, fake weeping, pulling her arms roughly behind her back and loudly snapping heavy cold steel handcuffs firmly around her trembling wrists. Another group of agents rushed the elevated stage, moving quickly to secure Gregory. Harrison slowly backed away, releasing his heavy physical hold and allowing the federal agents to violently drag my ex-husband up from the cold, wet floor. Gregory's expensive custom tuxedo was completely ruined, soaked in spilled water and crushed white roses. His face was entirely bruised and bleeding slightly from where Harrison had shoved him against the floor. They aggressively locked his hands in heavy metal cuffs, completely ignoring his frantic, desperate, pathetic pleas for his expensive lawyers. I remained standing perfectly still at the wooden podium, watching the glorious, chaotic scene unfold completely below me. The invisible guillotine had finally entirely fallen, and the sharp, heavy blade had completely severed the rotting head of their criminal empire. The room was absolutely swarming with flashing blue lights, loud tactical shouting, and the beautiful, satisfying sound of complete ultimate justice. I looked down at Gregory as the federal agents forcefully marched him past the stage. Our eyes locked for one final brief second. He looked entirely broken, entirely completely destroyed, while I stood absolutely bathed in the bright, brilliant light radiating total, unassailable power. The long, agonizing war was finally incredibly over, and I had entirely, absolutely won. The federal agents continued to process the massive, elegant room, completely taking absolute control of the entire luxury venue. The wealthy elite guests were firmly instructed to remain exactly where they were, while the agents began securing the premises for a massive forensic sweep. The local corrupt politicians, who had previously happily accepted Gregory's dark money, were now violently sweating profusely, desperately trying to avoid making eye contact with the federal officers. They knew the digital ledger currently glowing brightly on the massive projection screens would completely implicate every single person who had taken a dirty bribe. One of the senior federal agents, a tall, imposing woman with short, dark hair, walked directly up the stairs to the elevated stage. She approached Harrison first, shaking his hand with deep, sincere respect, before turning her incredibly sharp gaze entirely toward me. She looked at my tailored emerald suit and the absolute perfect calm I maintained despite the massive, chaotic, swirling madness happening below us. She simply nodded, acknowledging the massive, incredible effort it took to bring this entire completely fraudulent empire down in one single, completely flawless strike. We have teams currently executing simultaneous coordinated raids at the megachurch. And the luxury boutique, the senior agent stated, her voice clear and completely professional over the loud noise of the room. We also have a dedicated unit securing the physical server hardware and moving to apprehend the older brother, Bradley, based on the digital evidence you successfully provided. They will not be able to shred a single remaining document. You completely handed us the perfect, absolute airtight case. I offered the senior agent a simple, firm nod. The immense, overwhelming feeling of complete safety finally began to wash slowly over my tired mind. I knew my beautiful, precious Lily was currently resting peacefully miles away, entirely guarded from this massive public spectacle. I knew I had successfully permanently secured every single dollar of my stolen generational wealth, protecting our future completely from the arrogant monsters who tried to violently erase us. I watched calmly as Ashley was physically dragged through the center of the massive ballroom, her bright red designer gown trailing pathetically through the spilled champagne and broken crystal. She was screaming desperately for her wealthy friends to please help her, but every single person completely turned their backs, absolutely disgusted by the recorded audio of her cruel child abuse. She was entirely, utterly alone, facing the terrifying reality of a cold, sterile prison cell completely stripped of her fake, glamorous vanity. Gregory was shoved aggressively through the heavy mahogany doors, his head hanging in total, absolute defeat. He was completely, entirely bankrupt, publicly, thoroughly humiliated, and securely locked in federal handcuffs. He had absolutely nothing left in the entire world. The massive towering crystal chandeliers continued to shine brightly above us, casting a beautiful, brilliant light over the complete, total ruins of their fake, perfect lives. I slowly stepped away from the wooden podium, walking gracefully back down the carpeted stairs, completely leaving the chaotic, loud ballroom behind me. I walked out into the cool, quiet night air, entirely ready to go back to the remote woodland cabin, completely ready to finally hold my daughter and start our beautiful, peaceful new life. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was absolutely, completely perfect. The cold, heavy steel doors of the federal transport vans slammed shut with a beautiful, echoing thud that completely resonated through my entire soul. I stood on the pristine paved driveway of the country club, watching the flashing red and blue lights paint the manicured trees with bright, frantic colors. Gregory and Bradley, the untouchable brothers who had built a massive empire of lies, were currently sitting in the back of those dark vehicles wearing heavy cold steel handcuffs. They were entirely stripped of their expensive tailored suits and their arrogant, pious smiles. The federal agents had swarmed the building with absolute flawless precision, completely dismantling their fraudulent charity gala in front of hundreds of horrified, wealthy donors. Gregory had violently lunged at me in a blind, desperate rage, only to be effortlessly pinned to the hardwood floor by Harrison. Now Gregory was facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The criminal charges were absolutely staggering and incredibly comprehensive. Federal racketeering, massive corporate wire fraud, international tax evasion, and severe child endangerment. Bradley, the highly respected head deacon who used his holy church to launder millions of stolen dollars, was dragged out right beside his younger brother. His pious holy facade was permanently shattered into a million tiny, jagged pieces. The entire massive congregation would wake up the next morning to discover that their trusted spiritual leader was nothing but a ruthless, calculating criminal who stole from a grieving mother and an innocent, terrified child. The justice was so incredibly poetic and absolute that I could physically feel the heavy, suffocating weight completely lifting from my tired, aching shoulders. Ashley did not go quietly into the cool night air. Her ultimate public destruction was entirely broadcast live to her millions of gullible, adoring social media followers. When the federal agents initially approached her, she completely lost her mind. She screamed frantically, kicking her expensive stiletto heels and thrashing wildly in her massive red designer gown. The agents remained perfectly calm and entirely professional as they read her rights in front of her shocked, wealthy elite friends. They informed her loudly and clearly that every single piece of luxury property she claimed to own was officially seized as evidence of massive international money laundering. I watched with a cold, calculated satisfaction as a female federal agent reached forward and physically unclasped the heavy diamond necklace directly from Ashley's sweating neck. Ashley shrieked loudly, begging her wealthy elite friends for help, but every single person completely turned their backs on her. They had all heard the undeniable intercepted audio recording of her cruelly admitting to locking my beautiful 11-year-old daughter in a freezing, windowless concrete closet. She was entirely, completely alone and universally despised. The agents confiscated her sparkling diamond rings, her expensive luxury watch, and the keys to her imported sports car. She was left entirely destitute, standing on the polished marble floor of the country club with absolutely nothing to her name but the ruined clothes on her back. Her arrogant vanity had completely blinded her to the invisible guillotine I had carefully placed over her head, and now the heavy, sharp blade had fallen perfectly. She would spend the next several years sleeping on a thin, firm mattress in a cold, sterile federal prison cell, completely stripped of her fake, glamorous aesthetic. The subsequent legal battle was incredibly swift and entirely one-sided, because Harrison and I had meticulously handed the federal prosecutors a flawless, airtight case with exact offshore routing numbers and undeniable audio confessions. Gregory's highly paid defense attorneys immediately completely abandoned him. They absolutely refused to fight a losing public battle against the massive, crushing weight of the federal government. Gregory sat in the cold, sterile courtroom wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit, his hair thinning and his arrogant posture completely broken. He absolutely refused to look at me. He simply stared blankly at the wooden floor as the federal judge delivered the final devastating sentence. 35 years in federal prison without the slightest possibility of early parole. Bradley received 30 years for his extensive role in the church money laundering syndicate. When the heavy wooden gavel slammed down, echoing loudly through the silent packed courtroom, I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. They had ruthlessly, maliciously tried to bury me alive and completely steal my daughter's entire future. They had completely manufactured a fake narrative of my mental instability to destroy my pediatric nursing career and isolate me from society. They absolutely deserved every single solitary second of their cold, miserable confinement. The true beautiful victory, however, was not watching them suffer. The absolute greatest reward was the pristine, bright, sunny morning I walked into the family court building for my final custody hearing. The judge completely reversed Gregory's fraudulent sole custody order, apologizing profusely on behalf of the entire legal system for the horrific abuse my daughter had silently endured under their watch. I was officially, legally awarded full sole absolute custody of my precious, beautiful Lily. When I walked out of those heavy glass courthouse doors, holding her small, warm hand tightly in mine, the bright golden sunlight felt entirely different. It felt like a warm, protective blanket wrapping completely around us, shielding us from any future harm. We were finally entirely free to build the exact beautiful life we had always truly deserved. The federal government officially released the $14 million I had successfully frozen in the Cayman Islands accounts. The massive stolen inheritance my late parents had worked so incredibly hard to build was completely returned to my personal accounts with extensive added interest. I did not buy an expensive luxury mansion or a fleet of imported sports cars to show off to strangers. I completely channeled my late parents' genuine humble spirit and my own deep passion for pediatric medicine. I purchased a beautiful, spacious commercial building in a bright, sunny neighborhood, completely surrounded by massive green oak trees and colorful blooming flower gardens. I spent several months meticulously transforming the building into a state-of-the-art, independent pediatric health clinic. I hired a massive dedicated staff of incredibly compassionate doctors and specialized nurses providing top-tier medical care to children from all over the city, regardless of their family's ability to pay. The clinic features brightly painted walls, beautiful calming murals of ocean waves, and massive playrooms filled with educational toys. I named the clinic directly after my late parents, completely honoring their beautiful, enduring legacy of kindness and selfless community service. The process of physically building the pediatric clinic from the ground up was incredibly healing for my tired soul. Every single time I signed a massive construction contract or approved a detailed architectural blueprint using my own unbothered signature, I felt a deep, powerful sense of absolute reclamation. Gregory had tried to convince the entire world that my signature was completely worthless. He had explicitly forged my name to violently steal my power and my voice. Now my signature was actively creating a beautiful safe haven for hundreds of sick, vulnerable children. I personally selected every single piece of medical equipment, ensuring my staff had the absolute best technological tools available in the entire country. We installed advanced respiratory machines, comfortable reclining chairs for exhausted, worried parents, and soothing sensory lighting in every single examination room. The day we finally cut the thick, bright red ribbon at the grand opening ceremony, Lily stood proudly right by my side. She held a massive pair of silver scissors and beamed with pure, unadulterated joy as the local community clapped and cheered loudly for us. It was a complete, beautiful triumph of warm, brilliant light over suffocating, toxic dark. Our new home is a beautiful, cozy two-story house with a wide, welcoming front porch and a massive green backyard. It is entirely, completely different from Gregory's cold, sterile, sprawling country estate. There are absolutely no expensive crystal chandeliers or fragile imported vases that we are terrified of breaking. Our home is filled entirely with soft, comfortable furniture, bright, colorful throw pillows, and wooden shelves absolutely overflowing with our favorite books. Lily has her own massive bedroom, painted a soft, beautiful shade of lavender with a large bay window overlooking the blooming garden. She spends hours sitting quietly by that window, listening to soft music and sketching the colorful birds that visit our wooden feeders. We do not have any private security guards patrolling our property. We do not have complicated automated alarm systems dictating our every single move. We simply have peace, absolute, pure, uninterrupted peace. Lily completely blossomed in our beautiful new peaceful life. The dark, terrifying circles under her eyes entirely vanished completely, replaced by the bright, glowing, rosy cheeks of a truly happy 11-year-old girl. She no longer has to force a fake, empty smile for a perfectly curated social media photograph. She laughs loudly, freely, and genuinely. She made wonderful new friends at her new school and discovered a deep, beautiful passion for painting vibrant watercolor landscapes. Every single afternoon, she rides the yellow school bus directly to my pediatric clinic, sitting quietly in my warm, comfortable office painting beautiful pictures while I finish my daily medical charts. We spend our weekends baking sweet chocolate chip cookies, taking long, peaceful walks through the botanical gardens, and simply enjoying the quiet, beautiful safety of our own company. We are absolutely incredibly happy. Harrison also remains a very close protective presence in our lives. The retired federal agent frequently visits the clinic, bringing fresh sweet donuts for the nursing staff and sitting quietly in the waiting room reading his thick paperback novels. He is no longer just the intense, intimidating man who helped me burn Gregory's empire to the ground. He has become a true trusted grandfather figure to Lily, completely replacing the toxic, corrupt family she lost. He taught me how to find my own lethal strength, and I will be entirely forever grateful for his unwavering silent support. Sometimes, when the house is entirely quiet and the evening sun casts a warm golden glow across the living room floor, I think deeply about the concept of karma. Gregory, Ashley, and Bradley had genuinely, completely believed that their massive stolen wealth insulated them from the basic fundamental rules of the universe. They believed they could aggressively crush innocent people under their expensive leather shoes and simply walk away completely clean. They heavily relied on their fake, pious public image to hide their deeply rotting, decaying souls. But karma never ever misses an address. It simply waits patiently for the absolute perfect moment to strike. It waits until the villains feel the most arrogant, the most triumphant, and the most completely untouchable. It waits until they are standing proudly in the middle of a massive crowded ballroom, wearing their most expensive clothes, completely ready to accept a fake philanthropic award. And then it drops the heavy, invisible guillotine, completely severing their false kingdom and leaving them with absolutely nothing but the cold, hard reality of a federal prison cell. I no longer have any nightmares about the dark, freezing basement or the sterile, intimidating family courtrooms. My mind is entirely, completely free from the heavy, toxic chains Gregory tried to violently wrap around my neck. I wake up every single morning feeling incredibly rested, incredibly strong, and absolutely, completely ready to face whatever beautiful challenges the new day brings. I pour a hot cup of fresh coffee, stand on my quiet wooden porch, and breathe in the sweet-smelling morning air. I watch Lily run happily through the green grass, laughing loudly as she chases butterflies. And I know with absolute total certainty that every single terrifying moment of that dark storm was entirely incredibly worth it. The massive fire I started completely burned away. All the lies, the manipulation, and the absolute cruelty, leaving behind a pristine, fertile ground for a beautiful, amazing new beginning. We survived the absolute worst they could possibly throw at us, and we emerged completely, entirely victorious, ready to embrace a future built solely on truth and genuine love. Women are often taught to endure silently, to sacrifice our own peace for the sake of an illusion. But we must never let our devotion be mistaken for foolishness. When a toxic partner backs you into a corner, use your intellect, find your true strength, and dismantle their lies from the ground up. If you feel satisfied watching these arrogant betrayers lose everything, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video, and what state or country are you from? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.